Indology Festival 2024. Honoring and commemorating the centenary of the announcement of the discovery of the Indus Valley Civilization, our festival is aptly titled Harappan Civilization, a Century of Discovery. Spread across 6 days, we have scheduled 12 fantastic lectures by subject experts covering these various aspects of the civilization and giving us insights from various angles. A warm welcome to all of you on day 5 of our festival. Before we proceed, I'd like to share with you some images. These are the images that accompanied Sir John Marshall's announcement about the civilization in London Illustrated News on 28th December 1924. To read out the caption, this says, built more than 2000 years ago, but covering 2 strata of earlier remains, this 2nd century Buddhist stupa at Mohenjo-daro on an island in the dry riverbed. What a piece of history this is. Amazing to think that this is what the world saw first about this civilization. This is another wonderful image. One of the 2 sites whose remains are older than anything yet known in India. Prehistoric buildings excavated at Mohenjo-daro, Sindh, dating probably between 1000 and 400 BC. Now this one from Harappan. On the other newly discovered prehistoric site in India, occupied for many hundreds of years before the 3rd century BC, excavations at Harappa in the Punjab. And this one says, with flooring and conduit of glazed brick, a prehistoric shrine at Mohenjo-daro. Now, obviously, accompanying these illustrations was this large announcement. I'd just like to quote from a small portion of it. To quote Sir Marshall, he says, the remarkable discoveries illustrated here put back by several centuries the date of the earliest known remains of Indian civilization. I compare them to the work of Schliemann at Tiryns and Mycenae, where likewise it fell to the archaeologist to break new ground and reveal the relics of a long forgotten past. At both the places of excavation, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, there is a vast expanse of artificial mounds, evidently covering the remains of once flourishing cities, which must have been in existence for many hundreds of years. Of course, many of the facts are still not clear, like the true age of the cities. We may well be off by 1 or 2000 years. That's what he says. Of course, at that time, Sir Marshall would not have known that even after 100 years, many aspects of this civilization will still be a mystery to us. As pointed out yesterday, one important aspect of the civilization, which is still a mystery to us, is the Indus script. Scholars have been researching this script from various angles for a long time now, but the script still remains undeciphered. In the first talk today, Dr. Mayank Vahia will be touching upon this subject. His talk is called Understanding the Indus Script in the Context of its Culture. Another important aspect that is still mystifying to us is the climatic and environmental challenges that this civilization must have faced in the course of its existence over 2000 plus years. We wonder what was their coping or survival mechanism. Again, covering this topic in our second talk today will be Dr. Cameron Petrie, Fragile yet Resilient, Environmental Changes and the Indus Civilization. Before we move on to the main program for the day, as always, a brief introduction about Tamil Heritage Trust, our organization, especially for the benefit of all those who are joining us for the first time today. Tamil Heritage Trust is an organization that was started almost 14 years ago by a group of like-minded volunteers. Our main intent was to understand, appreciate, disseminate, and celebrate various aspects of Indian heritage and history, not just for the elite and the erudite, but the average public who may have a passionate interest in the subject. Towards this end, THT conducts various events throughout the year. We have our monthly talks on the 1st and 3rd Saturdays every month. Then we have what is called Pechu Kacheri or the oratory concert, which is usually conducted in the month of December over 2 days. All of you know about the famous Margari Isai Kacheris of Chennai. This Pechu Kacheri is meant to collaborate and coincide with that. Then we have the Indology festival, and we are on day 5 of that. THT also conducts various workshops for the average public who can register and join these. We have one-day workshops, which are called How to See a Museum, How to See a Temple, etc. Split into 2 sessions. In the forenoon session, we cover theoretical aspects of this topic. In the afternoon, participants are taken practically to a site to elucidate what was discussed earlier. Then we have classroom sessions, which are conducted on and off on subjects like the Grantham script, ancient Indian mathematics, ancient Indian astronomy, etc. Then another program of ours is called Alamar Avai. This is aimed at the school teachers of Tamil Nadu. Over a series of weekend lectures, various aspects of Indian heritage and history are discussed with the teachers, which they then will go back and disseminate amongst their students, thereby spreading awareness. Another activity which we undertake in the month of January every year is called Site Seminar. This is an in-house activity essentially meant for our own education and enhancement. We usually zero in on a particular site, and our volunteers study various aspects of the site for 3 to 4 months. We have in-house seminars, and then armed with all this knowledge, we go to these sites and study them fully. We also come back and document our experiences there. THT has also instituted 2 important awards. The first one is called, both these awards are meant to commemorate individual contributions to the field of Indian heritage, history, and epigraphy. The first award is called the THT Professor S. Swaminathan Heritage Award, named after one of our co-founders. The second award is called V. Venkaiah Epigraphy Award and is jointly constituted by the great-granddaughter of V. Venkaiah, the first official epigraphist of India, and THT. We have a dedicated YouTube channel. All our talks, links to talks are available there, right up to yesterday's talks. Kindly subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to receive notifications of all our future events. We have a website. These are our social media handles. If you want to join our mailing list, kindly mail us at this address. And most important, we are a voluntary organization and do not have any dedicated financial backing. So any kind of contributions from any of you is welcome. Kindly use this barcode and address to make your contributions generously. Now moving on to our topics. As I already mentioned, our first talk today is by Dr. Mayank Vahia and is called Understanding the Indus Script in the Context of its Culture. The grammar of the Indus script is now well understood, even if the meaning of individual signs and the reason for its sequencing is not clear at all. In his talk, Dr. Vahia will take a wider look at the issues related to the Indus script and the Indus culture as a living entity. He will also discuss the spread and evolution of the civilization and the complexity of its written text. Professor Mayank Vahia is a retired scholar from the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai, India. At TIFR, he worked on space-based telescopes that were flown on NASA's space shuttle. Later, he pursued his interests in the history of astronomy and science in ancient civilizations. He has worked on several megalithic sites on the belief systems of tribal communities in trying to understand their relevance to the growth of astronomy in India. After his retirement, he has taken up the responsibility of setting up an innovative undergraduate program in mathematical sciences at the Narsi Monji Institute of Management Studies in Mumbai. Welcome, Dr. Vahia. We are delighted to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gauri, for that introduction. So I'm going to talk about Indus script and Indus civilization today. In the script, I may add right at the beginning is that we already know the grammar of the script well. We know what is the sequencing of sign. We know what was written. We know which signs are follow which signs and so on. What we don't know is the meaning, and that has remained a great puzzle. And that is still a big puzzle because almost every model that has been proposed is inconsistent with the grammar that we have now discovered in the Indus script. So I'm going to take a rather broader view about the Indus script and its civilization. The first thing is that I'll discuss writing in the context of the civilization as a whole rather than as an individual problem of its own. I will then discuss the advances in understanding the Harappan miniatures, the script, and in the context of the organization of the civilization itself. Because I strongly think that we need to take a wider view of Harappan writing in cultural context in order to make sense of what is written. I will then comment on the context of writing and even the untranslated languages, how much we can understand of untranslated languages. I would like to begin by paying my respects to one of the great scholars in the field, Airavatan Mahadevan, who lived and did all his work from Chennai. And he visited us. We had a great privilege of him visiting TIFR. And what you see on the right side is this whiteboard on which he wrote everything and explained the Indus script to us. And we still cherish that memory and my respects to him. So first, let me tell you about Indus writing. One of the thing about Indus writing is that their basic creative work has been on miniatures. They are typically a few centimeters in size, um, and they are largely square, on which they have expressed whatever they wanted. So in this seal, which is rare, there is this double animal with leaves on the top, and the writing is at the bottom. In most other cases, we will see the writing is at the top. So this is the script at the bottom. This is the script at the bottom, and this is the design parameters. And this seal remains unique in many ways because I will show you that there is actually a fairly high level of standardization on the seals on which writing is done. So Harappan medium of choice for expression is these seals, which are typically 1.5 to 15 centimeters long, and the 15 is also very rare. They're typically 5 to 5 centimeters is the typical size. They seem to have been used for a large variety of purposes, which is what makes the whole problem difficult to understand. Apart from writing, one can see a number of interesting themes on these objects, and I will show you some of these themes. Almost all the written material is in the miniatures. We haven't seen large writing. There's only one so-called signboard that has been seen in Dholavira, and Bish mentioned that in his first talk. Professor Bish mentioned it there. And there is another relatively smaller 6 inches writing again in Dholavira. But otherwise, nowhere have we found writing in larger characters or on any other medium other than miniatures. The miniatures can be are largely terracotta, mud which has been hardened, which engraving is made and then hardened. But you do get copper and you get ivory and you get a few other examples of material. But most of it is in terracotta. Many of the seals have a holder at the back, and therefore you would think that they were used for stamping or something. But we rarely come across identical seals. So there are very few examples of identical seals, and therefore we really do not know whether they were probably not meant for stamping, but for simply for holding them together through a string or something. Maybe they were being tied to something. Maybe they were holding held a string or something. We really do not know. This is an example, a whole collection of seals. This, for example, is a 3 centimeter seal, and you can see the precision of working. Even today, with modern technologies, this would be a very difficult task to do because the whole thing is 3 centimeters, on which you need to first of mark out and decide that you want 7 circles which have to be at correct angles. And then on each of them around the center, you have 3 more circles which are typically a few millimeters. The whole thing is 3 centimeters. This is typically less than a centimeter in size. The precision and the accuracy is unbelievably great. And we do not know what tools they use to do that. This is another masterpiece of work. Again, a 5 centimeter piece. You can see a hedging at the bottom, but you can see that their designing was so perfect that there were no cramping at the end. There is very little evidence of any kind of cramping. They had managed to get absolutely smooth and correctly, exactly periodized seals. Clearly, they knew their geometry much better than what we give them credit for, and clearly, they knew their physical geometry much better than what we can ever appreciate. And we still do not know how do they do that. They even had some really interesting abstracts, which looks more like a fountain or something, but we don't know what it is. Then there are enigmatic pieces of miniature where you can see this feminine form because of the bangles, and there is something that looks like an Harappan sign, but we don't know whether it is a writing or whether it is some decorative piece. And then there is a whole bunch of leaves around. This is another interesting piece where there are seven women with their long hair and so on. It is presumed that they are women with long hairs. There is a bison over here. There is a woman in a sort of lotus form. There's a fish here, which is also a writing sign is also like that. These three are probably writing sign. There is somebody paying homage to this woman in the lotus, and the, there must be practically at least 25, 30 different interpretations of what this seal means. Again, it's a few centimeters across. So the precision of working is non-trivial. This is another enigmatic piece where there are three animal heads connected to one body. Two of them have this peculiar seal. Another one has a completely different kinds of horn. Again, this is writing, and we really do not know what it means. This is a seal I did not discuss till now because it is an interesting seal. Mahadevan has interpreted this as the direct evidence of bull fighting or capturing in Harappan time, because this is clearly a bull, and these seem to be human bodies, somebody thrown up, somebody thrown on the side, and somebody being pushed off by this horned bull. So this, according to him, is a representation of the game that these people used to play, similar to the bullfighting or bull running that we have in Italy and other countries today. And even in India, we have it at times. And he thinks each of these is a human form being thrown off by this. So we really have a huge variety of creations in Harappan civilization, all miniatures and all very fine. And these are not work done casually. This is not somebody sitting in the afternoon and playing with a piece of mud. This is something that has been done with great precision and accuracy. Wheeler has said, and who was referred to earlier, is that it is no exaggeration to describe them as little masterpieces of controlled realism. How much realism they could bring into these pieces of miniatures is phenomenal. And the monumental strength. In one sense, they are completely out of proportion because they're just 5 centimeters. And in some sense, they're completely related to the proportion. So, for example, a seal like the one that I showed you in the previous slide of this kind of bull chasing or something, or this kind of activities are clearly simultaneously full of realism and simultaneously too small to depict realism. And that remains the enigma of Indus seals. About the seals, they are masterful combination of artistic imagination, high degree of precision, creative technology, objective clarity, and fascinating ability to express themselves in an exclusive medium that, for example, even the current trends of miniature paintings in India do not match the size on which they do the painting. Nowhere in the entire human race do you find this kind of obsession is miniature. No other culture has ever shown this kind of obsession with miniatures. Mesopotamians have some interesting rolling seals, which are interesting per se, and they probably predate Harappan seals, but they seem to be parallel developments. So, but they do not use miniatures as extensively and exhaustively as the way Harappans do. There are a few seals in Mesopotamia which, on their own, seem to be quite confusing. But if you roll them on a mud, then the images that come out are pretty good. But that seems to be a rarity there, while it is a common thread in Harappa. To give you an example, this is a seal called M21261, again 3 centimeters or 4 centimeters wide. And if you look at the design, that little design that comes from here is actually, you can see this design here, and that red color, of course. Right. So you can see this design here, which is non-trivial, and you see it at many places. So there is this another enigmatic seal where there are three tigers, which have been connected again by similar signs. And this design is a very complex design per se. It requires multiple geometric shapes cut into a square, and then this little black part is used as a design structure. And it is obviously not random. It is not at one place, but they have actually been interconnected. It is almost like Penrose tiles. They cover the entire region with this design, except that there are gaps that it will leave. But essentially, it looks a reproduction of that, and they've even done it on larger size scales. This is a whole vase from one of the Harappan sites, and you can see that this kind of pattern designing seems to be something they're very fond of. There are other ones which are even more interesting, where there are enigmatic animals. So you have this odd kind of animal with an elephant trunk, uh, with a human face, with a bovine animal's body, with the tail of a tiger, and the white buffalo horns. Composite animals, created animals. There is another one over here where there seems to be a human form, actually explicitly feminine, with this long hair and enigmatic structures on the top. There is a script here. Here also there is a script, but we have no idea what it means. So Harappans were masters of miniatures. Why were these mini seals? Why did they use that medium? Is something that obviously remains speculative. Maybe they were easy to carry. You could transport them over long distances, and we know Harappans traded not only with Mesopotamians but also got their raw materials from as far away as Afghanistan and the Hindu Kush mountains and so on. Some of the material also came from Iranian. And Harappan script is also similar to Proto-Elamite, which is written in southern Iran. So somewhere there is a culture. We genetically know that the Harappans were similar to the southern Iranian farmers and so on. So there is a degree of cultural connectivity, and maybe they were using them as miniature pieces so that could be transported. They were in some sense easy to make. Once you were trained in making them, and then baking them to harden them was not a very great exercise. They were also largely temper proof. You could not break them without losing the information that was given them, and you cannot replicate them without losing some part of the information. That therefore they were difficult to recreate or replicate, except with extensive training. And even then, each artist must have had his or her own style of doing it. They're an explicit proof of a centralized training and administration. We have a list of about 416 Harappan signs, and I will come to that. And there is very little regional variation there over the entire Harappan civilization. What 1 million square kilometers, everybody writing in the same script with the same grammar, using the same set of signs, cannot happen spontaneously. So there must have been a centralized training and centralized administration where people were explicitly trained to read and write. So the writing must not have been a very common feature of Harappan civilization. It must have been undertaken by some people who were extensively trained in this. And one can make all kinds of speculation about the Great Bath, about the training, about centralized administration on that. The classical feature of Harappan civilization is that over 1 million square kilometers, it is highly standardized. Everything from brick making to blade making to weights and stuff like that was followed across the board over 1 million square kilometer, and that suggests that there must have been a centralized administrator training feature. On the other hand, each city has its own characteristics and its own specialization. So it reminds you to some extent of the Greek city states which came several hundred years later, but they also had a similar structure, but they were more at war with each other rather than homogenized. Well, in Harappan civilization, we see absolutely no evidence of wars. Cities have been destroyed by fires and they have been rebuilt and so on, but there is no evidence of large scale deaths or sudden death or violent death, or we haven't found skeletons which were of people who were violently killed or something. So it's a peaceful, and we haven't even found large scale weapons. So it was a peaceful civilization, million square kilometers, highly standardized, to the extent that some archaeologists eventually said the pattern is too standardized and variation is too little, and there are no sensational stories about one king having killed the other, etc. So it was even considered boring by some people. And about what 10 years ago, the magazine Nature from UK, actually had to run a story saying boring no more about the Harappan civilization, because everything seems to be so homogenized, and it's very difficult to find any kind of cracks in this huge, highly standardized, extremely peaceful civilization. In the absence of evidence of standing armies and such, that one must assume that they were the rule was sort of developed by consensus. So if you sort of follow the history in the mountains, you have this Loya Jarga in Afghanistan where they decide the leadership, etc. It's quite more than likely that they also had a similar system, because Loya Jarga we know goes back at least to 800-900 BC. Probably they learned that trick from that way of peacefully settling everything. So United Nations is not a 20th century creation. It was probably 25th century BC Harappan creation. Uh, that itself speaks a lot about the civilization. It is a civilization in every sense of the word. So these are some of the objects, and I want to show you two things. This is where the writing is. In each of them, these are the signs that are written signs, and the rest of them are stories. But you can clearly see that there was storytelling going on. There is this theme of a tiger turning back and looking at a woman who is sitting on a tree, and that theme seems to follow at many places. There are many examples. There are also stories of a very common kind where a single person, probably a feminine, holding two tigers by their neck and controlling them. In another piece, that person is actually well decorated, that lady is well decorated. So there must have been legends and stories in that culture which have been completely lost, about somebody who could manage to control two tigers or more, fight wild animals, and someone who sort of communicated with tigers and so on. But we really do not know. Those stories are gone and lost. Then there are interesting enigmatic figures like this, which has also been interpreted in variety of ways. Whether this is three-headed or one-headed is something you can argue endlessly without knowing what it is. And then there are animals facing you and animals facing away, and there is a little bit of writing on the top. We really do not know what they wrote. So that is what this story is about. Writing is something you encounter that encounters language from the outside. Writing and language are not connected. So, for example, in Arabic, the Devanagari script, you can write Hindi, English, Marathi, whatever you want, and even English you can write in Devanagari script. And similarly, the Roman script um, can be used to write everything from Latin to English and so on. So language and script are not necessarily connected. You can write multiple languages in the same script. And script usually comes from the merger of script and language comes from outside. They are not internally connected. A formal script encodes information. That is very clear, that you write only because you want to store some information, either because you want to transmit it or you want to remember it for future or whatever it is. The writing system can code multiple languages, and the writing probably was invented to aid memory, mark ownership, trade, and so on. But in Harappan cases, we really do not have ideas. It was not invented to express ideas because there are no poetries and there are no long poems and there are no pages and pages of writing. And the longest string of writing that we have seen on one side of a seal is 14. And if you go around all the sides of a seal, the best you can manage is 26 characters. These are not essays. They are definitely not essays. These are definitely not storytelling. This is something very cryptic and very beautiful. And my contention is that we need to get under the head of the Harappan, how they used to think, what they used to think, to be able to figure this out. From grammatical studies that we did at TIFR and our collaborators in IMSC, etc., we know the grammar, we know the syntax, we know which sign followed which sign, we know which sign can start the script, we know which sign can end the script, and there are only about 6 or 7 signs that can end the script compared to about 20-25 that can start the script, and all the other signs come in the middle. But even when they come in the middle, they have a specific sequencing which is simultaneously flexible and still driven by grammar. So we know the grammar of IndoScript quite well. This is most evident when you consider the modern human languages like mathematics. Mathematics is such a precise language, and and therefore it can encode a lot of information. Mathematics eventually is a language. It is a language in which nature also happens to speak, so we use it for sciences. But mathematics is a language in every sense of the word. So maybe there is something as compact as that going on in Harappan mind. They certainly were intellectually capable of doing something like that, but what they did is something that has remained an enigma. Uh, Whether it was you express ideas or contents or whatever it is, we don't know. Probably there were multiple layers of writing, multiple kinds of writing, and so that. But it's worth remembering that the practice of writing and development of a coherent system of sign, a script, is something that is seen only in complex societies. Writing is a feature of civilization. So clearly, Harappans were a fairly sophisticated civilization by any stretch of imagination. They could have written either to aid the memory, they could have written it to mark ownership, they could have written it to communicate over large distances, or for trading arithmetic about who has loaned who, what kind of money, or what kind of material exists in the given jar, or labels on material, identity of people, ownership markings. We really do not have any clue. The speculation of Harappan writing has been multiple levels. There are people who said that they are simply securing tags for goods that were being stored or imported or exported. There are identification mechanisms for material manufacturers, individuals, quantity, or whatever you have it. It could have been tokens as primitive coinages for exchanging goods, so sort of promissory notes kind of a thing. It could have been for religious purpose, but one of the most outstanding features of Harappan civilization has been that we have found no places of worship, no temples, no extra revered places, none of those things which would give you an indication that this was a place of worship. No places where there are exceptionally large footfalls and stuff like that. So religion itself, whether they were religious or whether purely secular, is a point on which you can argue for hours together. The medium used was clearly temper proof and durable, and certainly during the lifetime of the civilization, they wanted it to last. They probably didn't think that people would worry about it 2500 years later, but during that civilization, they definitely worried about it. And remember, it remained an urban civilization for about 1500 years. Indian civilization, from its last dark ages, is barely a few hundred years old. Harappans clearly did not have a monolithic usage. Even if you account from time of Buddhas, for example, we have been around for what, 2000, 2,500 years. Harappans also lasted 1500 years. Harappan civilization clearly did not have a monolithic usage. It must have been multi-purpose. The writing, a large fraction of miniatures have writing with three components. It has a script at the top, it has an animal at the bottom, and it has a kind of feeding cup at front, which is very unique to each animal. And I showed you there are very few examples where the script is written at the bottom. In almost all cases, the script is written at the top. We find that many of the seals with one of the first two items, and sometimes so you get seals with only script. There are places where there's script and animal with no feeding cup, and but there are never we have very I think no examples of script and just the feeding cup. If the script is there, it's quite likely that there will be an animal, and the feeding cup will only come if there is an animal. But there are animals without the feeding cup. So Harappan writing consists of 20 signs to 650 signs, depending on who you ask. And I will come to that question a little later. Those who claim the smallest number claim that they are conjunction of signs. So, for example, if you don't know Hindi, then ka, ka, ki, or a, I, all of them will look different. And therefore Hindi will have something like 435 signs or probably more. But if you know Hindi, you know it's just 26 signs, and then the rest of the mergers are of the vowels with the consonants, which give you all the variety it does. So whether we are so ignorant, we say that Harappan seals have what 400 to 600 signs because we do not understand their style of writing, whether they had consonants and vowel merger, because that is seen in scripts only in India. It's a unique to Indian feature. There are very few exceptions to that. Only Indian languages merge vowels and consonants to give you complicated signs. And like I said in Hindi, if you don't know, it is 450 signs because you do not understand this vowel consonant mixture. And if you insist that no, everything is vowel consonant, then the number of signs gets reduced to only 20 or 25, depending on your personal choices. So we really do not even know what kind of writing it is. And the smallest number of people claim that it is essentially conjunction and sign. It suggests that the script was what is called abugida, a mixture of vowels and consonants, something found exclusively in South Asian scripts. So all South Indian scripts, even Urdu and other scripts follow this style. A primitive form of abugida is used in number is used for numbers higher than numbers coded in separate signs. So, for example, in some sense, when we do 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., we do not have one size trick, one stroke, two stroke, three stroke, four stroke. We go in for more complicated presentations. Even in Roman alphabet, for example, 5 is represented as a V rather than 5 vertical signs, and so some amount of mergers have been done for numbers, but for sound and words, it's only in South Asia that we do it. Extremely useful to code language. It is extremely useful to code languages because it also delivers a pronunciation of that word with a high precision. In English, it is not unique. If there is a less sound, so you don't know whether this is smaller or this is smaller or whatever it is. While when you write it in language Abugida style, then even the pronunciation is unique. So what do we know about writing? We know the writing is highly ordered, but it has flexibilities, and I'll show you a very nice proof of this, that they had the flexibility of the kind. They also used to write right to left instead of left to right, which we write currently, but that was probably because of the way they were writing. If you're chiseling, then you don't want your hand to cover what you're chiseling, and therefore probably right to left writing made left to right mating made right sorry right to left writing made more sense than the other way around. They have the average number of signs on all the seals put together is only about 5 signs. There are seals with just one sign and so on. We know that the transition from Potter's mark to completed script was rather swift, and I will show you the evidence for that. And it disappeared as swiftly as it appeared, which remains enigmatic because we really do not know how Harappan civilization ended itself. That itself we do not know. It was not by war, it was not by destruction, it was not by external forces. Something internal seems to have collapsed, and I will come to some speculations on that. Writing was highly standardized across the entire region, 1 million square kilometers. It is not a joke. 1 million square kilometers. And depending on who you ask, they will even say it is 1.5 million square kilometers. The sign designs were identical across this region. The medium of writing was very similar. The sequencing of text was very similar. There is no difference in grammar from what we find in Mohenjo-daro or Harappa or Dholavira, etc. The grammar is the same. The sequencing of sign is the same. The signs that seem to have been used only locally are very few and very rare. So evolution of writing, and Jonathan Mark Kenner has made this beautiful map. The stage 1 and 2 Harappan civilization, 7000 BC, when we see the first first planned layout of Harappa in I forget the name of the city, but these are the habitation site that existed between 7000 and 3200 BC, and their writing that you find there are just about potter's mark, individual one sign here and there, which are essentially potter mark. If you go for 2800 BC to 2500 BC, now you see that the civilization is far more spread out. And even though you see post-firing graffiti that has been written after the pots were made, you still see them as individuals and so on. Some of them would become signs, some of them would completely disappear. So, for example, this obvious sign, a sun-like sign, and some of the other signs would disappear, while others would become formalized in the next phase. So, if you look at 2800 to 2300 BC, the Harappan civilization spread is more or less the same as I showed you in the previous picture. But now you can see that many of these signs get converted to formal signs, many of them disappear and so on, and you have a clear development of the script. By 2800 BC, we have clear script. The writing, as we know, was very clear in syntactic structure. It has normally been assumed what, so the general argument is, how do you start deciphering? You start saying vertical strokes are numbers, and then you build upon that. So if you take, for example, this set of Harappan signs which look like vertical stroke, and you can say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. First of all, those vertical strokes themselves seem to have a structure which we do not understand. And then if you say sign number 1 occurred so many times, sign number 1b occurred so many times, etc., and if you draw a graph, you get that the sign number 1 in its various variations barely appears 100 times. Sign number 2 in its specific variation appears 649 times, but the other variants are rare. Sign which has 3 strokes in its original form appears 300 times, but the other forms you don't even see. And you don't even see 10 or essentially sign with writing with 10 signs, etc., you really barely see any examples. So clearly, if it was numbers and numerics, you would have had a fairly uniform distribution of the usage of sign, and clearly it is not. So the vertical strokes where you generally begin by decipherment were not numbers. So these are very complex relationship between writing and animal motifs. We are just about to beginning to look into these features, but we don't really understand them as of now. The similarity with later writing is very difficult to establish. So Harappan script disappears by about 1700-1800 BC, and then Brahmi doesn't come out for almost 1,000 years after that. 700-800 years later, that we get Brahmi and then subsequently Nagari and other scripts. There have been 100+ interpretations of writing so far, which have gone from everything saying that it is completely random to numeric values to writing in some unknown language and poetry and so on. All of them fail to meet the strict criteria of the grammar of writing. So clearly, we have not got the grammar right, or any interpretation that he has is grammatically inconsistent. These are the signs of from Mahadevan's great corpus of 77, and he lists out 417 signs. Some, of course, look like animals and so on, representation of animals. Some look like human forms with all its glorious variations and all that. And then he has also listed out each seal. So seal number 4018, for example, has only these two signs. 4017 has this sequence of signs. That allows you to do studies on the frequencies and so on. So, for example, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, these are the 417 signs of Mahadevan. You can see that there is very little regional difference between Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. And for text beginners, essentially, there are only a handful of texts that begin the writing of Harappan civilization, and there are even equally few number of signs which end the script. So essentially, there are only about 6 or 7 signs which can end a text, and there are about 20-25 signs which can begin a text. So clearly, there is asymmetry, and if you think about it, even in Indian languages today, you can begin a sentence with a large variety of signs, but you can end them only with a few variety of signs. Somewhere there is a similarity in writing. And like I said, various people have created corpuses. The most famous is Mahadevan's corpus, which you have always used. There he has a collection of 417 signs, and then he has added later two. And if you look at variants, etc., and add them as separate signs, then it goes to 641. Earliest catalogs 31 and 34 had much fewer signs. Today, for example, there are in recent time there have been 3 or 4 different attempts to re-look at the entire seal set and to see how many signs are there, and the number has gone from anything from 610 to 704. And like I said, that if you assume that the script is Abu Ghida, this number collapses to about 30. So we really do not have a clear idea. The animal motifs on these seals are also not standard or uniform. There is a variety of kinds where they are essentially no decoration on the neck, and the animals look marginally different. Then there are some where the neck decoration is of a peculiar character, and they are another kind. And then there are simple depictions where the neck is completely clear. The turf or the animal feeding cup that I showed you also has a large variety of various kinds of designs on them. Yeah, this is the kind of variants that you get to see on animals. Um, so essentially, the Indus script disappeared suddenly at 1700 BC. We really have no examples of material on which writing has been done after 1700 BC. They would not. It would not appear on the subcontinent until Brahmi comes around 1000 BC. This was related to the end of a civilization itself. The whole urbanization, everything disappeared, and I'll come to that in a minute. Um, how they disappeared itself is a mystery. There is certainly no evidence of violence. There is no evidence of. Um, it was. I mean, it was not that the sides died one side. There were. You could easily classify 3 or 4 major cities in the Harappan civilization. So Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, Rakigiri are 4 really large sites, and they all seem to disappear at the end, and they are separated by more than a couple of thousand kilometers between Mohenjo-daro and Dholavira. But they seem to have died out more or less simultaneously within a matter of few centuries. I will show you. So we do not know what did it. So whether there were natural changes, whether the rains changed, whether the rivers changed course, whether there was a drought, etc., we really do not know. And that continues to be a matter of issue. And I think the next speaker will deal with it in a much greater detail. Economic collapse is another possibility. Maybe it was heavily dependent on exports. They used to get raw material, add value to it, and then export it to various countries, especially in West Asia. Maybe West Asian economic collapse because the West Asian civilization dies a few centuries before Harappan does. So maybe it was economic collapse. I will also discuss in some detail the possibility of why such a thing could have happened. Some clear There are some claims of scattered examples of residues of Harappan civilization. There is a claim that in bronze you see bronze in Maharashtra which were Harappan origin. There have been other claims of written material found, but these are not verifiable or reliable. Why the civilization disappeared abruptly, we really have very little idea. So we just take a writing in the context of the civilization. It is clear that we have this great dilemma in Indian prehistory, which is that all the evidence for Harappan civilization is archaeological. On the other hand, all the evidence for Vedic culture or civilization is literary. We haven't seen any Vedic period sites anywhere archaeologically, and we only have literary evidence. On the other hand, for Harappans, we have seen no written evidence anywhere. All that we have seen is archaeological sites, and that remains the great enigma of India's prehistory. New genetic data has thrown some light. It shows that the Harappans were connected with Iranians and Vedic people came from Central Asia. It seems to be two different groups altogether. But this data is still coming in. Even as we talk, this new data is coming in. It's not very clear. And therefore, Harappan and Vedic cultures are difficult to reconcile. And towards the end of my talk, I will talk about it in some detail. Uh, so, Harappan civilization is certainly local in the sense that it was entirely indigenous. It has very little by way of influence from Mesopotamia or anywhere else. All their cultural traditions were developed locally. Its architecture is unique, its technologies are unique. Several good and bad features of Harappan's culture were actually not taken up. And size wise, it doesn't matter, doesn't match. So, Harappan civilization was greater than all the other contemporaneous cultures. So, you take Mesopotamian, you take Egyptian, and you take Chinese and add together, their total area is far less than Harappan civilization. It was largest, biggest, and the most extensive civilization of that time. And it was before Iron Age. It was Bronze Age civilization before iron was discovered. Harappa has no iron. Genetic and archaeological data suggests that the Harappans had close contact with farmers of Iran, and probably the ideas of settling and farming probably came from Iran, is the suspicion. But they were not people of Vedic literature. So there is a lot of attempt now to try and see if Harappans were Vedic people, but there are too many problems. First of all, there is no horse in Harappa. And even the most ardent claimants claim one horse, one skeleton that they claim is horse, which is a very small part of. It's an incomplete skeleton, which is a very small part. And even if you agree that that is a horse, it is just one horse. While Vedic culture thrives on horses, so there is really no horse in Harappa. There are no cities in Rugved. On the other hand, it is essentially a nomadic life that is discussed in Harappa in Vedic literature. Many animals common to Harappans are not mentioned in Vedic literature, and many animals common to Vedic literature barely find a mention in Harappan civilization. Rigvedic people ate barley essentially as their primary food source, while Harappans were eating rice and wheat. Genetically, the two groups are very distinct. Like I said, Harappan seem to be connected with farmers in Iran, while the Rigvedic people seem to be more genetically connected with people from Central Asia. So the difference are clear. Both cultures are clearly different. So to look for Vedic evidence in Harappan civilization, to me at least, makes no sense. How do civilizations rise? It is worth looking at that. So essentially, if you look at the cultural complexity of a of a group, then if you're a hunter gatherer, you have a certain quality that is possible, and this quantified, but I'm not putting the raw table. So hunter gatherer had a certain quality of life that they could maintain. But what you could maintain and what actually happens at the beginning is a different story. So gradually you learn, for example, hunting, gathering, then you develop new technologies, etc. So your actual lifestyles actually keep on coming up until it reaches the peak of what hunter gatherers do. At that time, then hunter gatherer life becomes unsustainable. They go into farming and they become semi nomadic. And as they sort of develop their understanding of farming along this dotted line, by about 5000 BC, they seem to have come to saturation, saying that look, semi-nomadic lifestyle cannot sustain this kind of population. So they have a revolution. By then, metallurgy comes in, copper, etc., comes in, and the quality of life potentially takes a jump. Again, inventions and use of the metallurgy takes a little time, and they reach a saturation in settled form. At this time, urbanization comes into a civilization. The urbanization, of course, gives you significantly improved lifestyle, and that gives you the kind of saturation. But when the urbanization saturates, then you have a problem. At this stage, you need significant new technological evolution to go in. In case of Harappan civilization, what seems to have happened is that at the peak of their civilization, they had no new innovations came in, no horses, no iron, no other technologies. The result was that that lifestyle became unsustainable. So it's more than likely that the culture simply disintegrated because the life they were living became unsustainable. So the people simply dispersed away. They just left the cities and towns. And then when the second urbanization comes in the Gangetic Plain, which was probably precipitated by the arrival of the Vedic people, and then India again takes up again. And then second urbanization, of course, goes very far because it is in the Gangetic Plain, and then they develop iron, and then the iron tools, etc., sustains novelty for a long time, and so on. So that seems to be a kind of problem, that as the civilization maximizes the quality of life that you can obtain with given technology, the demographic pressure becomes maximum. The number of people that a given technology can sustain now reaches its peak. Resource availability becomes maximum, and therefore demand comes up for new technologies, and the culture must come up with new technologies to survive. At the peak of Harappan civilization, apparently they did not. So if they had come up, so script comes out somewhere at the peak of their urbanization, and it is over here that Harappan civilization disintegrated. Maybe there was demographic pressure, maybe there was environmental pressure, maybe there was a failure to come up with new technology which would have improved their life and so on. But somewhere here, around 1700 BC or so, the culture seems to collapse. It self-destructs. It is not a violent destruction. This is another interesting graph of what we have is urbanization. So this is Gujarat region, this is Indus region, and this is Yamuna region. And the blue colored lines are the urban settlements, and the red colored line is non-urban settlements, and we define them by the area. So the urban settlement, so the rural settlements actually come in Gujarat region by about 4000 BC, but they're seen much earlier in the Sindhu region. They come a little later even in Yamuna. Yamuna region actually is the last one to develop. So you have this Indus region where you have a lot of non-urban sites, and urbanization comes about 2500 BC. Urbanization seems to start simultaneously, except that it's slightly early in Yamuna region. But otherwise, the peak of urbanization in all the three cultures remains the same. So even though yes, Indus region has non-urban sites of Harappan much earlier, um, the urban sites come up more or less at the same time. The script gets invented at the peak of their urbanization. And then the script disappears by about 1700 BC when the urban sites have come to more or less to an end, and you essentially see semi-rural sites. In Yamuna region, you have first signs of second urbanization. You can then look at the complexities of this culture as they write. You can say, look, there are 26 odd parameters that define a culture, and we divide them into four phases: nomadic, rural, urban, and post-urban. And we say how much was their sensitivity to urban, how much was their exposure to environment. So nomads were very vulnerable to environmental changes. Rural people were even more vulnerable to environment because they were large populations and they needed large amount of water and so on. Urban populations tend to be a little more flexible because they can build up large reservoirs and large water storage systems, etc. And again, post-urban. And you can do it for environment, agriculture, animal husbandry, internal communication, writing, information, and so on. So clearly, nomads had no writing. Rurals would have that pottery marking and stuff like that. The urban phase has a lot of writing, and post-urban, many of the writing would be disappeared. So you can get this for 26 different parameters, and you can plot them. So, for example, at nomad level, what really matters is the population density, use of transport to effectively move over long distances, the sensitivity to environment, leadership would matter, and how they integrated the culture would matter. That is for nomads. For semi-urbans, for farming communities, for example, external threat now becomes an important parameter, because many of these things are settled. Population density matter, environment matters, and expertise now begins to matter because they will change the way life is done. And that is settled farming. Urban cultures are far more complex. They have to have mathematics, they would have information storage, they would have writing, they would have health issue, health management, and primitive medicines, and so on. And a whole bunch of parameters would run their life, and each of these would be interconnected. And in the post-urban phase, when civilization disappears, essentially many of these parameters disappear, and writing, etc., disappears, and you have environmental issues and stratification. So you can see how culturally these societies evolve through various phases of growth and decay. In the urban phase, leadership and writing are a unique signature that provides. Now, the leadership, of course, is not just the question of who is leading the hunt, but who is actually managing the entire civilization with all its complexities. And health and other parameters also become important as we look at that culture. Another interesting feature of Harappan civilization is the fact that the number of sites, if you count, and the distance of. So you take each site and count how many sites are how far away from given site, and then you co-add. So every site in some sense is at level 0, and all the neighboring sites are counted together, and all the data is co-added. So for example, the first group distance is less than 100 kilometers. So if you have a big or a settlement in this is between 5,000 and 3,500 BC. If you have a big township, then there would be a lot of small sites around it. Then there seems to be a gap for about 400 kilometers when the second collection of sites comes in. So the first group is very close to itself within 100 kilometers. The second spike seems to come at around 450 kilometers. The third spike around 500 kilometers, and the fourth spike at 700 kilometers. And this is true for all times. So this is 5000 BC all the way to 1500 BC. You can see this valley. Typically, what happens is that each urban sites requires a large number of rural sites to provide them with their daily necessities, food, water supply, etc. So two cities cannot grow within 50 kilometers of each other. They have to be separated by several hundred kilometers. In modern technology-driven civilizations, typically 150 kilometers is the average distance. In Harappa, the distance is about 400 kilometers. But you can clearly see that there is a separation exactly as you would expect in any dynamics of civilization, where a large site would then need to have everything within a few hundred kilometers absorbed within itself. So the next one can only be about 400 kilometers away from the first one. That is how the resource management was done. And writing appears in 3000 BC. And this gap is about 400 kilometers at its peak, 400 or 200 on either side. And at the highest, it is 700 kilometers. And you can even see clustering. So if you look at each city and ask how many are there within 100 kilometers, you get 2 or 3 clusters. As you increase your tolerance to 200, 300, 400 kilometers, they become more unified. And only if you go to 500-kilometer communication length do we really get homogenization. So clearly, in order to reach homogenization, 500-kilometer communication was required. Standardization across thousands of kilometers was required. So Middle East has been creating intricate. So in Middle East, for example, we have seen terracotta pieces of somewhat similar kind, but they're clearly far less, far far more dense than ours are. There is no evidence of writing there, and that is what makes Harappan so unique. And their writing has been on large clay tablets against Harappan, which has always been on miniatures, and their pieces tend to be circular, while Harappan pieces tend to be square. And there are about 20 examples, 26 examples to be precise. Well, there are seals in West Asia which use Harappan signs, but the grammar is completely different. The sequencing is completely different. So somebody is probably trying to write another language using the same script, but we really do not fully understand these writings. On seals is believed to have been transmitted from Harappa to West Asia. What does it tell us? It tells us it is clear that Harappan civilization was highly developed and isolated groups. They had closer contact with each other. Their writing was highly standardized, and there's a very high level of standardization in what they did. And this is not at all easy to achieve. We must not underestimate the level of organization that the civilization managed. Coming back to the problem of decipherment, the problem to decipherment has been many. First of all, the writing is cryptic. Like I said, the average number of signs is just 5, and the largest is 14, and largest all side considered together is 26 signs. We don't even know if it is linguistic writing, but I will show you something interesting in a minute. The syntax has the same flexibility as a language, but we do not know what they wrote again. The writing, like I said, is highly standardized. We have no bilingual text. The reason, for example, while Egyptian hieroglyphs, etc., were decoded because we had this famous Rosetta Stone, where the same text was written in 3 different scripts, and therefore they could decipher them. We have no such bilingual text for Harappa. We have no literary evidence of that culture and its language and its rulers and so on. So we do not know. We have no clear evidence of continuity, and almost certainly there was a major discontinuity. Like I said, 100 more attempts have not left anywhere. However, Harappan script has been mathematically shown to be highly structured, and that is similar to formal language. I'll come to that evidence in a little. We know how to write in Harappan script, even if we don't know how to read it. So I can assign meanings to Harappan signs and then write my own and start writing essays in Harappan script without any difficulty. But I would assign set of meanings to the signs which we don't know whether the Harappans assigned the same sign, same meaning to the signs or not. But we have already reached a level where we can write fluently in Harappan script, but we would assign our own meanings to those things. So, for example, this is an interesting study we did some years ago, where what you have is flexibility in writing against the number of tokens. So, you take each token, a token that appears very rarely to a token that appears many times, and see how many tokens it appears with. So the first is the most rigid system where where signs are supposed to follow specific signs only, and those very rigid systems don't get anywhere. Music, on the other hand, is extremely flexible. So music, so over here, which will be extremely flexible, and therefore you have everybody mixing with everybody else. But the languages have a certain level of rigidity and flexibility, which allow you to express various ideas and meanings, and that is what makes it so powerful. And it turns out that Indus writing, which is this red color line, falls right smack in the middle of this. It had rigidity which was enough to make the grammar firm, but it had the flexibility to express a whole series of ideas which were otherwise not expressible in any other writing system. So clearly, Harappan's writing system was a very flexible system, and that's why I said we can write in Harappan, but we can't read as the Harappans meant it. Decipherment has other issues. The appearance and disappearance of the writing has been uh, are both of great importance. The appearance indicates the rise of civilization, large scale organization, and specialization. The disappearance could have been for anything, either the trained elites, the training system collapsed for whatever reason, or that kind of trained manpower was no longer required because the culture was disintegrating. Um, Probably it was replaced by a simpler form of writing, but we haven't seen any evidence of that. However, the disappearance of the script appears so suddenly, uh, while um, while the decay of the culture also is equally quick, but it is completely non-violent. And the reason for the disappearance, like I said, can be argued for a long time. And this is the kind of map that we think we have about. Think there is speculation that there was probably Ahar and Kaya. So there is a town here, for example, which actually speaks Proto-Dravidian. So there's while there are other sites which we don't know what language they spoke, copper hordes go into the second urbanization, Harappan civilization, some of the feature etc. come all the way down, and languages and structures evolve. So we have some idea whether what happened to post Harappan sites and so on, but we don't have a very firm database to go on. Okay, what happened? While every evidence suggests early movement, serious movement of Harappan people happened only around 1500 BC, and especially this post-Yamuna map probably didn't occur until we got iron, which could cut large trees and sort of provide heavy weapons, which was not there with the Harappans. So the study so far has it that uh, it was a highly coordinated, centralized teaching. There must have been flexibility of writing. Long distance trade we know definitely happened because we have seen material traced from Afghanistan and other places coming down, value added and then sent out and so on. Maybe there were sentences like sending rice to Mohenjo-daro kind of a statement. We really do not know. We basically do not know what they wrote, except that the writing system was very good in terms of its ability and flexibility. It seems extremely unlikely that it was anything literary because the sizes are small, so small. Only haikus can be written in 18 characters, nothing else can be. The relation between motif and writing material is unclear, indigenous information is unclear. Harappan script had multiple uses, probably, and we need to separate out those issues. There are larger issues of Harappan civilization. Writing involves a kind of cognitive and physical process. It is highly sensitive to the information that you are trying to code and the reliability of information transmission that you want. Writing relies on many of the same structures that knowledge represent. So it has to have a grammar, it has to have a content, it must specify what you are doing with it and so on. And therefore, writings have a characteristic distinctiveness about themselves. And physically inscribing symbols and creating it into a writing is a major intellectual growth. Writing systems do not themselves constitute a language. The same set of scripts can be used for multiple languages and multiple purposes. We need to get a better hold of the way the Harappans were thinking and rather than behaving. Their behavior and their archaeological evidence we have. So, what are the paths for decipherment? We can probably use archaeologists can give us more data, but since Mahadevan's last corpus, there has barely been 10% increase in the amount of data. We have some idea about the syntax. We have some idea about sign modifications, and I will come to that in a minute. With respect to other entities and written materials, I'm going through a little faster because I want to leave some time for questions. From computational linguistics, we definitely know the grammatical structure and the context of other cultural aspects we need to integrate into that. So the final answer to Harappan writing may well involve understanding the whole bunch of other issues, including Harappan collapse of the civilization and so on. There have been some indications, like I said, of even evidence of them coming through South India, but we do not know. There's this enigmatic town in Upper Sindh which speaks Proto-Dravidian languages, and we don't know how that connection happens. The eastward movement around Gangetic Plain brings the second urbanization, but that was probably driven by the Rigvedic people. Genetic data shows two different patterns of populations and so on. The most likely scenario, therefore, seems to be that either a drought or a disease or an economic collapse or collapse in social structure is what caused the death of the civilization, and people simply seem to have disappeared. And there seems to have been dispersal of population, but the technologies and knowledge was not carried through. So second urbanization is very different from the first urbanization. So we need to get an unusual perspective or an insight which is not going to be linearly available. Some spark of understanding we need. We need to map out the origin and movement of seals and so on, so that we can talk about trade and other things in more detail. Reason for the decline, I'm going to simply skip. Basically, we know that it was not violent. They had no standing army, um, and there seems to be a steep sudden decline. I showed you this graph earlier. Possible scenario is that they became part of the Vedic culture, but there are several difficulties. I already told you. So, for example, Rigveda explicitly says that I do not worship the 26 uh, bone, the animal with 26 spinal cord bones, which is wild ass, but the 27 ribbed horse. Horse has 27 ribs in its spinal cord, while the wild ass has 26. And Rugved is very explicit in saying that these 26 ribbed well animals are not what we are talking about. Harappans were highly urbanized. There was no clear sign of worship or religion. They ate very different kind of food. Vedic diet was more limited, and Vedic people seem to have come from Central Asia, a point that I don't have time to sort of elaborate on. The other possibility is that Harappans migrated to the south, and therefore Dravidian culture represent Harappan civilization. But then there are problems there also. The time difference between the last Harappan town and the first urbanization in South India is about 1,000 years apart. The distance between the Dravidian region and Harappan region is large, and why were there nothing in between the two? We do not know. We know, for example, that Vindhyachal mountains have proved to be a great deterrence of people from north coming to south, and we really do not know how this migration happened. Uh, there are only a few examples of replication of Harappan civilization in south and so on. The connection with older and Mesopotamian culture is not yet fully understood. So, if there is a bilingual text, it will probably be in West Asia and not in India. Many Harappans seem to have come through Bolan Pass. The culture is much older and must have been influenced by Harappan, the Iranian one. And we know that Harappans had close contact with people of Euphrates and Tigris. Um, they also had some idea of writing on miniatures, but you do not find the same level of extensive computation that Harappans had. So what next? We need to interpret it. We people have suggested Dravidian. People have suggested that they are just tag labels, just identifying people or items and their quantity and so on. Some people have suggested it's purely numeric. There are some people who have suggested it's completely random, and some people who have suggested that it is Sanskrit. And it's easy to show that none of these are consistent with the syntactic analysis. So there's something more profound to this writing. The way to go forward probably is to get the subtleties of difference in. So there must be multiple levels of writing for multiple uses. We need to separate out those things and so on. I'm really seriously running out of time, but so there seems to be a mix of individual and compound signs. There's a flexibility of Indus writing. We know the grammar, but we have no model that is consistent about the contents of that writing, and we need to look at synonyms. So, for example, in computational linguistics, if you look, you can see synonyms. So, if you ask the computer that, look, I find a sign with for symbols, a writing with these signs, what are the possible signs that could have gone into that? And it turns out that the computationally, these three signs are replaceable with each other. These three are three enders. And syntactically, these three are replaceable. Syntactically, these three are replaceable. These two are replaceable. So we have some idea about simpler syntactic similarities. Whether they are synonyms, we do not know. Whether they have the similar meanings and therefore they are replaceable, or whether they are syntactic replaceables, we do not know. Whether they are words with similar meanings or whether they are just grammatical structures with similar meanings, we do not know. We need to be able to figure that out somehow. So, for example, I have food to eat or I have chocolate are different entities, but difficult in the but they are both in the context of eating. You can have a sentence which says I have clothes and I have no clothes, which are grammatical synonyms except that they are opposites. I have food and I have food and I had food are two grammatical synonyms. The difference is in tense, the difference is in grammars, the difference is in entities, and so on. One case it is food, and one case it is chocolate. Whether these synonyms are food and chocolate equivalent, or whether they are synonyms of I have clothes and I don't have clothes, or whether they are the sense of I have food and I had food. Grammatical, we really do not know. Somehow we need to be able to figure out these kind of things in order to work on feature decipherment. Similarly, there are signs that seem to repeat themselves, which is a unique feature which has been used by some people to argue that this is random writing, but it is not random. But we do not understand why this repeated sign, why is the same sign written twice, and there are many, many examples of same sign being written twice. What are these similar signs which have the same thing? So, for example, if you look at these all these signs seem to have a basic structure which is like this. on which various components have been added, which would of course remind you of Hindi or Sanskrit or any of the Devanagari script written material, where we add the vowels to the consonants to make complex words. Is this that? We really do not know. So, for example, we know that there are these kind of structures which do not appear as common signs, but which seem to be value adders to the various signs. So whether they are phonetic additives to change the sound, or whether they are grammatical additives, or whether they are short forming, we really do not know. But there are some 10 or 15 such add-ons which seem to only come um, on with something else and not independently on their own. So we really do not know what these add-on signs are. They're still mysteries that need to be looked at. So thank you very much for listening. And this is the end sign for Harappan civilization. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'm open to these questions.
Yes, sir. We do have quite a few questions.
Okay.
And I don't know, we have 15 minutes to discuss.
Yeah, we have 15
so
minutes.
we have time. The next talk is only 7:05. So we do
No
have
problem.
yes. So before I would even like to take up some of the viewers' questions. See,
Badri, can you come on video?
I am on video. Oh, okay.
No, I mean,
I will also add. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. How about you? You want to be also?
It's okay. No,
the question. I will bring you on just once again. Yeah. So, Dr. Vahia, if you really look at, these are people who were dealing with Sumerians or the larger Mesopotamian region.
Correct.
Surely you would have thought that they were communicating something to them. There is mention of them there, that they would have learnt and also marked that missing Rosetta Stone. There was a very clear reason why they should have produced it. Any conjectures on why they didn't do that at all?
My personal belief is that we have not completed the excavation. There must be a Rosetta Stone. I'll tell you what happens. First of all, there is a lot of trade between Harappans and Mesopotamian people. Secondly, there are about 25 odd seals in Mesopotamia which use Indus script in a different grammar. So somebody knew the meanings of these signs, and they were trying to write their own language in there.
Right.
Those seals are circular compared to square seals of Harappans and so on. So there are very clear indications that these are Mesopotamian.
You were saying that those seals have exactly the same characters.
Yes, but
except
the sequencing
presented
is
differently in a different combination, even.
Yes, that's right. That's right. That's right.
The grammar.
So clearly, they were writing something.
Grammar is different.
Grammar is different. Yes, the grammar is different. Very much so. So that's why I think it's a different language being written in the same set of signs. Okay. So, for example, Russian and English look very different.
Right.
But they are both essentially using the old Latin characters. Okay. So that happens, and clearly Harappans had a lot of trade with it. So people and Harappan civilization in that sense was complete within except for trading. So they would not need a Rosetta Stone to translate things for Mesopotamians. Mesopotamians, on the other hand, would need to understand what the Harappans have sent with their writing. So they would need dictionaries, and they would need Rosetta Stones. Right. On the other hand, what has been worrying me for a long, long time, and I don't have any answer for this, is the fact that if the more compact the writing, the more extensive as the dictionary has to be. Because otherwise you can't make sense of what is going on. And there are no dictionaries that we have found. See, if I write elaborately, then you really do not need. For example, for poetries require far more explanation than essays.
Than long prose. Yes.
Correct. So somewhere along the line, the training feature must have been so good that a handful of scribes who were prepared and who sort of went around writing all knew the meanings of these signs, but they would have had their personal notes because they're 400 signs. But we haven't found any dictionaries. But the more compact the writing, the greater is the requirement for the dictionary. And therefore, Harappans would have had to have very good dictionaries, and we haven't found any.
Okay. Okay. I really like that you talked about that you can assign your own meaning to these Harappan symbols. Correct. And write a complete, self-consistent writing of your own, except that it has nothing to do with what the Harappan
Exactly.
did.
Yes, yes,
That's a very
yes,
interesting
yes.
way of seeing it. A few interesting questions. There's one from Ayesha Khatun. Uh, she's asking, can it be possible that the letters present in the Harappan script were not mere letters, but connoted longer paragraphs in small characters? Can that be a possibility?
That can be a possibility, but we don't know what the long paragraph was. So for us, it is blind. But there are interesting signs. I showed you one that looked like a goat. There's another one that looks like a cat with a tail and all.
Right.
So maybe it was a combination of an animal sign which was somehow integrated in the script. There are sequencing of script where the animal motif actually is in the middle and so on.
No,
So
you.
they,
Sorry,
yes.
please go ahead. No, no, I will ask
So
the
we
question.
really each sign probably had a far deeper meaning than what the sign alone would tell, and that's what I was talking about dictionaries, saying the dictionaries would be much more elaborate.
Yeah. Now, if in the Egyptian writing, you have clear, well-defined pictograms, which are pictures that
Correct.
you can pick up, and then something which is highly stylized and not really direct one-to-one. Now, that is
Correct.
also not the case here. The icons are disproportionate, large, and
Yes.
have meaning of their own, and the writing is entirely different, much smaller, stringed together, and have a
Correct.
different meaning of their own, or at least
Correct.
what they connote. So that,
Correct.
okay.
I mean, it's very clear what is the image and what is the script. There is no
It is. It
situation
is.
of
It is.
confusing one for the other.
No, no. There are just a warning. There are a handful of seals where you have writing on either side and an animal motif. This it is of the same size. But
Okay.
that seems to be a later evolution. The problem with Harappan, one of the problems with Harappan civilization is that early excavations were done with great excitement, and therefore the chronology was not maintained. And therefore, we don't know which seal was found at what depth. And therefore, we do not know the periodicity. It can be recreated. It can definitely be recreated by carbon dating and stuff like that. But it has not been done, is a statement of fact.
I in fact mentioned that stratigraphy or whatever it is called,
Yes,
that was
stratigraphy.
done.
So we will have to recreate the stratigraphy by using some of these terracotta pieces which will have organic material and then try and figure it out. There are ideas and there are people who are working on this, but we really do not have any results as of now.
You
Uh,
said something about not being monolithic in use. What did you mean by that?
Single meaning set of meanings. So it is everything for trade only. Maybe there were some of it was for trade, maybe some of it was for commerce in the sense that they were currency equivalent. In some cases, it was a person identification. It could be multiple uses.
Same script.
If you, for example, ask the computer saying that, look, this is the entire written material. Can you see different kinds of clustering? The computer tells you that there are 9 different kinds of clusterings within this writing.
Gauri, there
This
are
is
a lot of.
unsupervised
Yeah,
computer
yeah,
are
yeah,
being asked.
yeah, yeah,
Sorry.
yeah,
I don't think we can ask all the questions, but let us at least
yeah, yeah, yeah.
your 4 questions at least. So there is Professor Paramita Das. She is
Yes.
asking, is a script written from right to left? And Alan George is asking, wasn't Harappan script written as Boustrophodon? Which I just quickly checked Google. It says right to left on the first line and left to right in the second line. So you can.
It is to some extent like that. Yes, it is right to left and then goes left to right and so on.
Okay.
The reason why we know it is right to left is that there is cramping of signs on the left side. So they started writing elaborately, then they ran out of space and cramped it and stuff like that. But if I remember right, it is in that S shape, as it were. So
Okay. So
writing
right
is
to left and
basically
then it
down
is
and so on.
continuing into left to right.
Yes, that is what my memory currently says.
Okay.
Yes.
So Alan George again has a couple of other questions. Have you
Yeah.
ever tried to correlate scripts in Harappan seals from Mesopotamia with the
Mhm.
Harappan names which we know from cuneiform inscriptions, so as to decipher at least names if they were included in the scripts on seals? Will that be too unrealistic to attempt such?
Yeah, because the sign design is very different. So you cannot sort of associate saying that, look, this set of meanings. People have tried saying that, look, these signs look similar to these signs in other scripts, and therefore meaning may be carried forward. But then syntax fails.
Okay.
That is a
Uh,
problem. The
okay.
structuring is a single.
I
So
understand.
Harappans almost certainly created the signs and the meanings on their own.
Right. Okay. He has another question. Is other than the term mlecha, according to Charles Allen, do we know any of the other Sanskrit terms which probably may have been derived from Harappan language, and can that be helpful in deciphering?
So, if you look at Vedic literature, there are several hundred words which are borrowed words, and which probably came from other languages that were spoken in India at that time. And even though there is some what 200-300 year gap between the the Vedic people really coming in 1500 BC or so, or even if you assume 1700 BC, then there was a marginal overlay. As these people were dying, the others were coming in. So it is quite likely that some of these 300 odd borrowed words were actually words spoken by Harappan. But
Okay.
they were certainly, for example, Pali and Magdi were the common language at that time. Sanskrit was not a common spoken language of that time. It was always a language of the intellectuals. And there are Pali and Magdi words in Sanskrit literature we know. Some of these words, maybe if you can't trace their root, they may be Harappan in origin. But we really do not have clear indication of this.
Okay. Then the question of possible connection to Dravidian, Tamil, etc. So Agni has a question: what is the evidence that connects the Indus script to South India? And he's also again in another point was talking about it's is it something it's been Vincent Aubert in fact who is suggesting that Tamil language has more commonalities with the sign language. Your comment
And
on this?
there have been, so Mahadevan was a votary of Dravidian, Harappan being Dravidian. Parpola has been a very strong
Right.
proponent of Dravidian and so on. So there have been people like that. The problem is, and so Mahadevan's arguments are actually fairly more complex. He says prefixing and suffixing style is not like like any of the North Indian languages, but more like South Indian languages, etc. But these are indicators, and one can argue either ways on either side until we can sort of get some hold on somewhere a meaning. But there is a very strong proponent group which thinks it is Dravidian, and there's an for example, about what 6-7 years ago, somebody had actually published a whole directory in Current Science saying that we have completely deciphered it. Some are Malayalam words, some are Tamil words, etc. But they are all original Dravidian words. And we took that dictionary and showed that grammatically it is completely off track.
Okay.
So that has been the bane. Now, anybody who is deciphering, please should not start by looking at the sign and assigning meanings and then trying to assign sign meaning to other signs. Look at the syntax. We already know the syntax in its complete detail. Like I said, we can write Harappan and then use that syntax to try and infer what the meanings might be. So we need to reverse the process by which we attempt to interpret this script.
Okay. Um, there is one other theory that Vincent Aubert has asked. I've studied multiple seals and have a very strong feeling of them being geographical regional maps.
So there is somebody, yeah. So there is somebody called Bhaskar who is from Chennai, who
Bhaskar.
actually believes very strongly, and he has published 3 or 4 papers in various journals,
Mhm.
where he tries to claim that there was a seal I showed you where which was probably three-headed or one-headed, can be argued. There are 4 animals on the side, and he
Okay.
claims that each of these 4 animals represent 4 different regions within the Harappan civilization, and that central motif shows the unity of that entire culture. There have been people who have done that interpretation. I have not seen any problem with that. But the basic assumptions are arbitrary, and we need to be able to independently strengthen them. So it is quite likely that in many cases, each animal referred to a particular region. So rhino was one region, elephant was another region, a
Mm.
gharial was probably the Indus River's mouth, and so on. There have been interpretations like that, which I find very fascinating and very interesting. But it still begins, it is not very clear why. But there is, like I said, Bhaskar has published 3 or 4 papers on this, which are very thought provoking. I would not often say that that does not seem to be correct.
Okay. You have been talking about Airavata Mahadevan.
Yes.
About in 2014, I think one of his, probably his last talk, she gave in Rojamuttaya Center
Correct.
on his hypothesis at that point in time. I was there in the talk. He sort of suggests that there is the Sanskrit, the Rigvedic language is it's a rough or wrong translation, and I'm just paraphrasing from memory. And the Tamil version has fewer or no errors in it in terms of understanding it. So it's a sort of effectively saying that the Indus writings are precursor to both the northern and the southern language in a sense, but the northern ones have a lot of errors in them or mistranslations in them. Do you like to comment on that, or have you discussed
So,
this
yeah,
idea with
first
the
of all, yeah, I would sort of respect everything that Mahadevan says. Okay, I have an intrinsic respect for him. And I think in many ways he's right, in the sense that Harappan civilization was certainly the first and great civilization of one of the greatest civilization of the world in India. But I think it was independent of the Rigvedic literature culture. But the base existed when the Rigvedic people came to India from the north. This cultural values do not go away and disappear easily. Languages do not disappear easily, even if writing disappears. And we know that Rigveda has borrowed a lot of words. There are somebody called Witzel has created a dictionary of some 400 words which don't seem to be Sanskrit in their origin, which seem to have been borrowed from other languages. And Sanskrit is perfected over time. In its original form, Sanskrit must have had ambiguities, but by the time they start writing the Vedic literature and Panini comes in, the precision is very high. That is why it becomes a completely artificial language and not easy to use in daily language. So I would agree that any sort of commonly spoken language has a certain style to it. A formal language like Sanskrit has its own style to it, and error correction, etc., become very complicated in each way. So I would sort of implicitly suggest, I agree with Mahadevan that Harappan writing was the mother of all writing. So I personally, though I must have not many of my colleagues believe me, I strongly believe that Harappan writing is Abugida. They were consonants and vowels were mixed, and that they did because they wanted to write in a complex manner, on a seal. And then Indian languages, even if they were 1,000 years later or 700 years later, they copied that style because it gave you a very compact language. So yeah, Harappan would be the mother language as or mother script of other scripts that would.
But Mahadevan's point was that it's on the language front as well, not just the script.
It
That
could
that
be. It could be because Harappans also would have had the same problem. What is written is very formal. What was spoken is colloquial. So they would also have had this Sanskrit kind of a problem where people spoke Pali but wrote in Sanskrit, and it was an allied language. Probably we don't even know whether it was a language, by the way. Okay, it could just be writing of information while people spoke whatever they spoke, Pali or whatever they wanted, or even Dravidian. There is, like I said, there is a village that spoke Dravidian even today.
uh, so
Yes,
one last question. There's a question from Shubha Kandekar. Dolavira signboard, the sequence found in it,
correct.
has it been repeated in any of the seals or other
No,
writing?
no. I mean, that's a unique sequence. That
Okay.
is a unique sequence. I think it has some 10 or 12 signs, and that sequence is unique.
But it's still fitting into the beginning, the first character and the last character.
Yeah,
Does it
yeah.
fit
So
there?
grammatically, it is not. Grammatically, it is consistent with Harappan's grammar.
Okay. But it has
But
not been
that
repeated
particular
anywhere.
sequence, yes. So it could be a city name, for example, for all you know, because it is apparently on the northern entrance of the Harappan of Dholavira. There is this huge sign that was there which had fallen off. So it is more than likely that either the city name or name of the palace or name of the person who built it or the ground around which and so on.
Okay.
But grammatically, it is Harappan. Sign wise, it is Harappan and it belongs to a Harappan town.
Okay.
And it is unique in its sequence in that sense.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. I know there are many more questions,
I
but
can
we
imagine.
run out of time, and
Yeah, Dr.
uh,
Petrie will must be getting
this
upset
is
saying
with,
it is time to
there
say
are
all that.
still a lot of controversy. There are questions, people asking don't rule out Vedic connection or that, be open-minded. So there are some strong advice given to you,
Yes.
which I think is
Yes.
important. Yeah, I think it was Dr. Rajesh Rao of University of Seattle.
Yeah. We
He
are
was able to,
collaborators. In that paper that I showed you, we are
right.
collaborators on that paper. We have
So he
several
was,
papers together.
yeah,
Yeah.
he was one of the speakers in our earlier
Okay.
version of the IndoFest on a different topic. He said he was getting fairly nasty threats sent to him by email because of his thesis and what he was presenting. So
Yeah. No,
it's
people
not.
feel very passionately about this subject. I agree. That's why I said but the evidence is this evidence. Maybe the evidence will change. Like I'm still open to the idea that it was Dravidian and it could be, but it doesn't seem to be linguistic at all. According to me, this is coded information for whatever reasons, and there are 9 different kinds of clusters. Maybe one of them eventually would find its way into Sanskrit, another would find its way into Dravidian. We don't know. We really do not.
Thank
But I
you.
would be open to all kinds of possibilities in future.
Thank you, Dr.
Pleasure
Vahia.
is mine.
Over to you,
Pleasure is
Gauri, to introduce the next speaker.
Yeah, that was an excellent speech, Dr. Vahia. Very, very interesting.
Thank you very much. Thanks you.
Yeah. Moving on to the second talk for the day, we have Dr. Cameron Petrie talking about fragile yet resilient environmental change and the Indus civilization.
Slide, Gauri.
Huh?
Slide has to be.
Oh, so sorry. Yeah.
So my apologies. I will look up this lecture in the PowerPoint
Sure.
because I need to go somewhere. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So I take your leave.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. We have Dr. Cameron Petrie talking about fragile yet resilient environmental change and the Indus civilization. Climate change and collapse are major topics at the top of the global agenda today. There is an increasing recognition that critical lessons can be learned from past instances of success or failure to deal with acute and long-term changes in environmental conditions. The Two Rains project set out to characterize human-environment interaction in times of stability, change, and crisis by investigating the environmental and cultural context of the Indus civilization. This project looked across disciplinary boundaries to investigate diversity, change, adaptation, collapse, resilience, and sustainability. Dr. Petrie will be discussing about the range of novel insights provided by the above project in understanding the success and vulnerability of the Indus civilization. Professor Cameron Petrie conducts research on the archaeology of India, Pakistan, and Iran. He joined the Department of Archaeology in Cambridge in 2005 as the Research Council's UK Fellow in South Asian and Iranian archaeology and became a lecturer in 2010, senior lecturer in 2014, reader in 2016, and professor in 2022. Prior to coming to Cambridge, he was the Catherine and Leonard Woolley Junior Research Fellow at Summerville College, Oxford, and completed his PhD at the University of Sydney. Over to you, Doctor. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that very warm welcome. And it's a great honor to have been invited to speak at this event. And it was very nice to hear Dr. Vahia's presentation. I realized in some ways he's more brave than I am by taking on such a complex topic, or complex in many respects. But I realize taking on something that's quite complicated as well and complex. And no doubt we'll get a range of feedback and opinions. I will try and share my screen so that you can see what I will be speaking about. Is that all visible?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So I'll try to be efficient and clear and hopefully raise a range of issues that will allow people to ask questions at the end. But I guess that the useful starting point is to say that this is what I'll be speaking about now is effectively the culmination of a research project or a series of research projects that started in 2008. And this research is very collaborative. Although I'm based at the University of Cambridge, since 2008, I've been collaborating with Professor R.N. Singh from Banaras Hindu University. And we've been engaged in large-scale landscape survey and reconstruction, excavation, and also a range of scientific analyses. And although we didn't especially set out to investigate issues of climate and climate change, it became very obvious when we started to do our work that these were extremely important topics. And we were particularly interested in trying to understand the nature of change as it impacted upon the Indus civilization. So you can see at the bottom, there's a series of project icons. The Land Water Settlement Project led on to the Two Rains Project, which led on to the Tigris Project, which has now led on to the Masa Project. These are all actually interconnected research endeavors. Not all of them have been interested in issues of climate change and collapse, but especially the Two Rains Project. We have very much taken notice of the fact that there is considerable degree of interest in crisis, change, collapse, and different sorts of narratives. And in actual fact, if we look at human research and scholarship over human history, there are two very, very different perspectives that dominate a lot of academic research that runs in the background. And these can be summarized as the difference between a uniformitarianism approach, where some scholars have argued that there was gradual, long-term, slow change. And these are the sorts of principles of change and transformation that underpin our understanding of things like deep time and geology. And in many ways, that contrasts with a view which is grounded in the concepts of catastrophism, whereby the history of life on Earth has been interrupted at various points by cataclysmic events, processes of creation and destruction. There are often myths that involve floods and other types of large-scale transformations. There's a lot of historical scholarship that refers to the processes that drive extinctions of animal species on Earth over time. And we also have quite explicit evidence of large-scale climatic events that, such as the Toba eruption or the Chicxulub asteroid encounter, that have direct impact upon life upon the Earth. So we have these two contrasting views. And in some ways, those sorts of views are played out in the archaeological scholarship that is revolving around our understanding of the rise of civilization, but also transformations and even collapse of civilizations that occurred in the past. And there are different schools of research that are, some of which you have argued that things such as mega droughts and large-scale processes of human environmental destruction have caused big problems for human societies in the past. And there are others who take a counter-argument that say climate and environment are important, but they are not necessarily a smoking gun that explains socioeconomic and cultural transformations. And it's perhaps obvious and goes without stating that these sorts of arguments have an obvious modern resonance and relevance to people that are interested about where we are at the moment, what's happening with our climate, and what are the likely outcomes of us either intervening in some ways or not intervening at all, and where we might end up. So from an archaeological perspective, we are actually in a relatively unique position, because by its very nature, archaeologists are able to look at what happened before, often what happened during, and especially what happened after certain types of processes. So we, in the context of the Indus civilization, which we're talking about, we have a time depth of our knowledge that allows us to understand changes in processes. We also benefit from the hindsight that we have at the present. And from looking from the present, even back into the very recent past, we can see that the climate and the environment that we live in and are faced with undergoes change at quite a regular pace. When I first started doing my research, I was struck by the fact that there was actually a list of historical floods and droughts that had impacted upon the Indus River. In 2010, there was a dramatic monsoon season rainfall in the northern parts of Pakistan that resulted in a mass flooding of the Indus River itself and many, many parts of the Indus River basin. This flooding event put 1/5 of Pakistan underwater and impacted upon the lives of 21 million people who were either injured or rendered homeless. The likelihood that this is not an unusual event was emphasized in 2022 when there was another unusually high season of monsoon rain. In this particular season, the monsoon rain fell further to the south out onto the plains and had a dramatic impact upon the plains of Punjab and Sindh. And what we saw again was a vast area of Pakistan was put underwater. Many millions of people were injured or rendered homeless. So the argument in some respects is that, we have a situation here where we maybe ask the question, is this part of a natural cycle of processes? Or are we actually witnessing the impact of climate change in the modern context? Or are both things happening simultaneously? In each case here, we're in the living memory of these events, and we don't necessarily know what the long-term impact on population and the environment will be of these processes. What we do know is that we are now in a situation where, due to the nature of the modern world, financial benefit and aid can be introduced to help people. But we also know that those sorts of things were not necessarily available in the past. In addition to there being instances of far too much rain, there are instances in the recent memory, and this is just one example of news stories from the BBC website in 2016, which emphasized that India was undergoing a dramatic water crisis in the monsoon season of 2016. And there was an expectation that multiple millions of people would be affected by drought. There was arguments about the degree to which rivers might need to be diverted, questions about whether or not this was the worst water crisis that was present or not. This emphasizes the importance of rain and rainfall in the Indian context, but it also highlights vulnerability. And the map on the lower right-hand side emphasizes that the areas in red are parts of modern India which are facing very, very high water stress. Part of that water stress is related to variations in rainfall, but we also have water stress caused by over-exploitation of groundwater. So we have multiple processes that are in operation simultaneously. And this sort of complexity is emphasized, to use yet another example. Now, this is a modern example where we know that in the early 2010s, there was a civil war that occurred in Syria. And what has been noticed in this particular news story from Al Jazeera was that the civil war was actually occurred in the aftermath of several periods of drought. Now, what we know is that the drought in Syria drove people away from rural areas towards urban areas. And then the civil war in Syria originated with riots and urban dissatisfaction that resulted in civil conflict, which in turn resulted in the dispersal of refugee populations, which has an impact and creates problems in countries outside the area where that particular crisis was taking place. Now, it's very simple to lay these points out one after the other and to draw an implication that this is all interconnected and related to climate change. Further studies have shown that climate change is not a single cause. There are multiple factors and multiple causes in all of these processes. So it doesn't make sense to say climate change causes collapse in a simple way. But climate change is absolutely a factor, and the environment is also a factor in many of these processes. So where all of this preamble becomes relevant is to highlight to you all that in recent years, and as recently as 2018, there has been a very overt attempt to correlate events of climate change in the past with collapse of ancient civilizations. And the most notable example was the division of the Holocene epoch, the period that we live in, was divided up into 3 chronological periods, the early, middle, and late Holocene. And the identification of the Megalian age was actually connected to the identification of evidence of a climate change event that was identified in India. And the arguments at the time and the initial press releases were very vocal in emphasizing that the evidence for climate change that had been found in a cave, in a stalagmite, which you can see on the right-hand side, matched with evidence for global scale civilizational collapse. Perhaps inevitably, there was an immediate response from a number of archaeologists who disagreed with this type of interpretation. And there ended up being a direct conflict between the different sides of the academic debate, those who saw climate change as being a smoking gun explanation, and those who argued that things were much more complicated. And that debate got to the point where the people that had done the division of the chronology of the Holocene actually argued that there was an inaccuracy in the release of information. The argument, as you can see in the quotes here, were that the Megalian age as defined had nothing to do with archaeology. The division of the Holocene is purely a climatic and a geological series of events and arguments. So the earth scientists backed away, but in many respects, we're still left with this argument. Do we have impact of environment and climate on human populations? And how then do those human populations respond to those processes of change? Now, in order to get to the meat of, to use the phrase, the proverbial majority of the talk that I'm going to present to you, I need to make sure that I introduce you to a series of terms just to make sure everybody is on the same page in terms of the information. Now, I'll be using concepts of change and variability, but I'll using this idea very flexibly. And by, we see change and variation in terms of environment and ecology, but also in terms of cultural behavior. We also see adaptation. And when I talk about adaptation, I'm primarily going to be speaking about human behavior and human adaptation. There are also other terms that will come up. Particularly the concept of resilience, which is a term that largely can be used in animals and plant biology, but also humans, about the ability to rebound and recover from misfortune, shock, or trauma. It's basically about the ability to be robust and also to adapt. Sustainability is actually connected to resilience, and there are many different definitions of sustainability. But largely, they refer to the ability of human populations to be sustainable in the face of change, and the degree to which one can be survive over long periods of time reflects a population's ability to survive without depleting their natural resources and their life resources in the longer term. Now, in relationship to, or in counterpoint in some respects to the concepts of resilience and sustainability is the idea of fragility. Now, in archaeological terms, this was put forward relatively recently by Professor Norman Yoffe, who argued that fundamentally many early cities and also states were fragile. And he argued that no matter how strong these states and cities appeared to be, and how powerful rulers appeared to be, political entities and also often cities were vulnerable to change. Now, the case in hand that I'm going to be speaking about will be the Indus civilization. Now, I realize that you've had many talks this week about the Indus civilization, so you don't need too much information about the what, the where, and the when. I guess critically, it's important to say that we had a period of urban development that occurred, and it appears to have spanned about 600 years. It might be defined as or described as an experiment with urbanism, because what we did witness with the Indus civilization was the deterioration of urban settlements and a process of deurbanization. Now, what that process represents is much debated. Many have suggested that this represents a collapse. Some have argued that it's a decline. and others have suggested that it might be some sort of transformation in socioeconomic life. One of the themes that I'd like to mention in the lecture is that I actually personally believe that change was actually fundamental to the Indus civilization. It was something that was undergoing change continually, and that is represented in the building fabric, the nature of behavior, the nature of settlement and settlement distribution, and it is largely related to the nature of occupation in the Indus Basin and the way that people were adapted to that landscape. And I hope that through this lecture or this presentation, I'll make it clear what I actually mean by that. And with any luck, I'll also convince you that what I'm suggesting may have some validity. Now, the Indus civilization, it is important to state, is actually very different to the other complex societies that coexisted at the same time. It's not the same as Mesopotamia or Egypt. It's fundamentally different in its socioeconomic structure, and it's especially different in terms of the distribution of large-scale urban centres. We know that there are Indus sites that can be described and categorised as being urban, but they're actually relatively few in number, and they're actually considerable distances apart. The closest two are almost 300 kilometres apart, and the furthest two are over 800 kilometres apart. These are cities that it is not possible to travel to and from with great rapidity. This is completely different to the situation in Mesopotamia, for example, where some of the cities in southern Mesopotamia are as close as 25 kilometres apart. So it is actually feasible for a human on foot to walk between them in one day. That is impossible in the Indus context, even in a boat. So by its very spatial arrangement, it is different. The hook for me that emphasizes why the Indus civilization is extremely interesting is because the rural aspect of Indus life is extremely important. In actual fact, the majority of Indus settlements are rural sites, 1 or 2 hectares in size. We know that farming was actually extremely important. Human populations made use of a range of animals, particularly the zebu, but also sheep, goat, and water buffalo. They made use of winter and summer crops, but realistically, the rural aspect of the Indus world is extremely important. Nevertheless, the predominant information that we know about the Indus civilization comes from these large urban centers, especially places like Mohenjo-daro, which we know is extremely sizable. It's made up of multiple different mounds. It has evidence for planning, drainage, the use of fired brick, mud brick. It's often stated that there's a lack of overt monumental architecture. But what's characteristic about Mohenjo-daro, if you look closely at the excavation reports and the plans of the site that have been published, is that change, rebuilding, remodeling, and restructuring of the site, of the city itself, actually occurred repeatedly over its time. So I think in many respects, change in some form was very commonplace. Now, what I find interesting about Mohenjo-daro is that it's actually made up of multiple sectors. We're very familiar with things like the Great Bath and other structures at Mohenjo-daro as well. People are familiar with structures known as the stupa. There have often been suggested that there are some very, very large residences at Mohenjo-daro. But what is now obvious to many scholars is that there are probably multiple areas within Mohenjo-daro where power was concentrated. This suggests that there's some form of heterarchy or horizontal relationship between different parts of the city. There's possible people that exert either mercantile power, monetary power, economic power in different areas. It's also been argued that there was a degree of egalitarianism within the site of Mohenjo-daro as well, largely because we lack overt evidence for extremely wealthy individuals. So it suggests, these arguments do suggest that there's a much more horizontal relationship that existed between the populations that lived in cities like Mohenjo-daro. There was not very dramatic extremes in wealth accumulation, and presumably there was also not extremes of lack of wealth and great inequality in that direction as well. A lot of the material that we know about is the sort of thing that Professor Vahia was speaking about in the previous lectures. We have an abundance of things like seals that have signs and iconography on them. We have an abundance of material evidence and material remains. Things like weights that suggest the existence of a common weight system, carnelian beads that are very, very widely distributed, steatite beads, and other sorts of material. So in one way, it's possible to suggest that there is a layer, an overarching layer of connectivity between all of the different populations in the Indus civilization, the Indus Basin. But there is also a considerable degree of diversity that exists in cultural behavior that underpins all of this commonality. So myself and some others have argued that there's a veneer of similarity, not stipulating how thick that veneer might be. It might be extremely thick, but also there's a lot of variation underneath what appears to be a surface of similarity. So again, emphasizing this coexistence of different things at exactly the same time. Now, this diversity in practices is emphasized repeatedly the more that you look at the details of the evidence. We know, for example, that Indus populations made use of a wide range of different crop types, cereals grown in the winter or the summer, pulses grown in winter or summer, and fruits, oil seeds, and fibers. But what is also clear is that not every single one of these crops is found at every single one of these Indus archaeological sites. There is a considerable degree of variation and diversity. And what's interesting is also, although we know that Indus populations made use of winter and summer crops, that also has important implications for the practicalities of farming, and in many ways is dependent upon knowledge of crops and knowledge of how to farm them, but also knowledge of weather systems and the availability of water in particular seasons. What you can see on the right-hand side is a graphic depiction that shows the sowing seasons and the growing seasons and the harvesting seasons of different crops. Now, most of these crops that we know that the Indus populations were using need to be sown at slightly different times, which has all sorts of implications for the organization of labor, access of water, the provision of water, harvesting times, storage, etc. This is by no means a straightforward endeavor. It's very, very complicated, and it requires substantial farmer knowledge and organization. Diversity is also seen in issues of water availability. Across the Indus River Basin itself, we know that water comes from various sources. It comes from the rivers, it comes from rainfall, it comes from flood inundation, and it also comes from the use of things like wells, which we know are particularly common. But what we know, and I'll emphasize this shortly, is that many areas that the Indus populations lived do not have regular access to water. As a result, Indus civilization settlements have a range of different water features and water facilities, including the very famous tanks at Dolavira, which were likely connected to water supply systems and were used for storage of water over the longer periods. It's also been demonstrated in areas of northern Gujarat, for example, that ancient populations would have been familiar with areas on the desert margins where rainfall would have occurred in certain parts of the year, and farmers would have had the ability to wait for rainfall and then to sow fast-growing crops like millet in areas where rain would settle, particularly in between sand dunes. And then those fast-growing crops could be grown and harvested and used opportunistically based on where the rainfall occurred. And there are now attempts to work out precisely where this sort of farming might have been possible in the past. I realize what I'm going through is a very long background and preamble, and I will get to the research of our project shortly. But I think I would be remiss not to make reference to the many discussions that have been put forward about the lost rivers that are likely to have existed in different parts of the Indus River Basin and the potential that they had impact upon the Indus civilization. There are actually standing debates about the date and historicity and the activity of the Ganga-Hakra River, which is often associated with the Sarasvati River, which is referred to in various texts. Now, there have been research projects that have attempted to date when this large river, which you can see moving from I guess, the top right across the central part of this image, across the plains of northwestern India, coming from a particular source in the Himalayas. There have been arguments about when this river actually carried perennial water. What is unclear is, or sorry, what I should say is what is clear is that this is by no means a simple scenario that can be reconstructed with any degrees of easiness. This is most likely a very ancient river that was extraordinarily dynamic. And over time, this river has changed in nature and character quite dramatically. So it does not have one explanation that explains what happened and how it operates. What's clear that even now, when large-scale rain falls in the catchment of the Himalayas, even the rivers that have been dried for centuries or millennia often carry water in them. So even though they might not be a perennial river, they can operate as an ephemeral river at different points in time. And I'll talk a little bit about the importance of rivers as I move through the rest of the talk. The last thing that I think it's important to mention is the nature of change that we see at the end of the Indus civilization. What we do know fairly definitively is that all of the Indus cities were ultimately abandoned, although they were not all abandoned at the same time. It seems as though there was a peak in Indus urbanism around 2200 or 2100 BC. And then after that, over a period perhaps extending for up to 200 years, there was a dramatic reduction in urban settlement and a shift in the distribution of settlements to different parts of the landscape. This process appears to be accompanied by a reduction in craft activity, the gradual disappearance of all of the administrative technology and administrative activities and paraphernalia, the disappearance of seals, the disappearance of weight systems. We also have evidence for increases of incidence of disease and infection in the burials from Harappa, which suggests that there was increases in violence within urban contexts and a general air of problems. And it's also been suggested that this process of change is characterized by changes in behavior, so that arguably human populations responded by trying to change the crops that they grew in response to this crisis. Now, the projects that I've been involved with have been very interested in taking on this large topic. What is the nature of diversity in the Indus civilization? And how do Indus populations interact with their environment? And in some respects, answering a large question. Now, inevitably, a research project that's run for a long time probably involves lots of different people. This is just an example of icons of the different universities and the different people that have offered us funding. It's almost impossible to do large-scale archaeological research without a substantial amount of funding support. And I would like to thank everyone that's given us that support. But rather than spend too much time on that, what I would really like to do now is to go through the evidence that we have to support the research that we've carried out that came from us posing the question, does climate change really cause collapse? Now, that was the fundamental question that we set out to answer with the Two Rains project. But this is very much part of a continuum of research questions that we're interested in. This is a deliberately simple question, and it's deliberately provocative in the sense that it's really trying to challenge the argument that the correlation of a piece of evidence for climate change and a piece of evidence for transformation in an ancient civilization doesn't necessarily mean that the two things were completely explained one by the other. But there is a proliferation of causation arguments. When some of my colleagues and I published a research paper in 2013 that argued that there was actually evidence that the Indian summer monsoon during the period of the Indus civilization underwent change, the headline in Nature, a journal that had actually refused to publish our article, came out with the claim that a 200-year drought doomed the Indus Valley civilization. That headline, of course, was not taken from our paper, but it was the logical short version that was attractive and easy to say, but far less easy to explain. The reality, the archaeological reality, is far more complicated than a simple correlation between two separate things. And as I mentioned at the beginning, archaeology is in this unique position where it can look at the before, the during, and the after, and therefore get a much more coherent explanation of change in the past. So the Two Rains project set out to really investigate the impact of climate and environment on the populations of the Indus civilization. And we set out to do this by looking at many different categories of evidence, including rainfall and weather systems, looking at landscapes and settlement systems, subsistence practices and methods of food consumption, and also an attempt to reconstruct the dynamics of decision-making and social choices. And to do this, we combined a number of complementary data sets. So we worked across disciplinary boundaries, working with earth scientists, geographers, paleoclimate reconstructors, weather systems modelers, archaeologists, archaeological scientists, and also people involved with agent-based modeling. And I'll touch on each of those things briefly in what I will highlight to you. So from my perspective, what I find extremely interesting about the Indus Basin as a geographical area, this is broadly construed in including areas of modern Pakistan and India, even moving up into the high Himalayas, and also including areas of Afghanistan, is that we have an area that is no doubt significant in terms of being the home of one of the great ancient civilizations, but one that is fundamentally different in its very geographical and environmental nature. So this part of the world is characterized by the coexistence of winter rainfall system and a summer rainfall system. And both of those rainfall systems provide water for the Indus River Basin broadly construed. And we know that Indus populations live in proximity to the floodplain of the Indus Basin, but also had differential access to the water that fell from the sky and that flowed along the ground. Now, this map shows the distribution of the left-hand side of the winter rain and on the right-hand side, the summer rain, as we are aware of in the modern world. What you can see is that there's a dramatic range of variability. Some areas get rainfall in both seasons, some areas get rainfall in neither of the seasons, and some areas get rainfall in one or other of the seasons. This is quite a dramatic difference to what we see in Mesopotamia and Egypt, for example. What I find particularly interesting about this is that both of those rainfall systems are variable. They have unpredictability in them. When the winter rain comes is variable. How much winter rain comes is also variable. Same with the summer. But in a sense, for the present and the past, these rainfall systems are broadly predictable in the sense that we know unless something unusual happens, there will be winter rain and there will be summer rain. And we coined the phrase, or we borrowed the phrase, predictable unpredictability to characterize this weather system. What we think happened was a shift towards an unpredictability in the sense that there were changes to the winter weather system and the summer weather system that produced a degree of uncertainty and risk for the populations of the Indus River Basin. And there were a number of changes that occurred as a result of that. So how do we get to this idea? Where are we getting our reconstruction of this process where we think that there's a considerable degree of unpredictability in the context of the Indus civilization? Luckily, we have a range of different evidence. One of the PhD researchers working on the Two Rains project studied weather patterns and atmospheric conditions and looked at the dynamics of the weather systems that influence the Indian summer monsoon on the one hand, and the winter rainfall patterns, which are described by some as Western disturbances, largely because they originate in the Mediterranean, travel across the Iranian plateau or via the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, and have an impact upon the areas of the Indus Basin. What is clear is that the two weather systems are extraordinarily variable. They are variable within an individual year. they are variable between years, and they are variable on decadal, centennial, and even millennial scales. This is all dependent on the orientation of the Earth, where it is in its cycle around the sun, and where the Earth itself is also in broader processes. So there's a high degree of seasonality, and there are local triggers and disturbances in the system that cause change. So change again in the weather is common. How do we understand the weather in the past, though? We've made specific attempts to reconstruct the paleoclimate of different parts of the Indus River Basin. Our earliest work focused on looking at lakes that had been discovered on the desert margins in Rajasthan and Haryana. By taking samples from dried up lake beds and analysing small gastropods, shells, for using stable isotope analysis, it was possible to look at the changes in the carbon and oxygen isotopes of these gastropod shells from different depths in the lake. And then when you date the lake, you can observe change over time in the degree to which a lake is a deep lake, or a lake is a shallow lake, or a dry lake, whether it's saline or not saline, and various other dynamics. Now, what we discovered by looking at a lake to the south of New Delhi called Kotla Dahar was that there was clear evidence for the weakening of the Indian summer monsoon around 4.2 thousand years ago. Now, that date connects to the date of the 4.2 event, which I mentioned, the Megalayan period that was referred to by the Earth scientists. However, some of the other lakes that we sampled suggest that there were also other patterns in place. Some of the paleoclimate reconstruction suggested that the monsoon had increased in the years before 4.2, and there were also evidences of other events earlier on which showed climate change at 8,000 years ago. So largely, we can see that there are instances where the monsoon fluctuated in the past. The piece of evidence that is more recent is the reanalysis of another core of samples off the coast of Karachi, close to the mouth of the Indus River into the Arabian Sea. Now, what you can see by the analysis of small microorganisms from these samples is that for the first time, the ability to differentiate changes in the winter rainfall system from the summer rainfall. So in this graph, you can see that the upper part of the histogram shows variation in winter rainfall, and you can see the chronology running along the top, I hope, and the lower one shows variation in the summer rainfall. What this data from this core, the 63 Ka core, shows is that the winter and the summer rainfall systems were not directly correlated, but were actually partly independent of each other. So in actual fact, it suggests that the winter rainfall was actually strong in the period immediately before a substantial decline. So this period from around 4,400 BP, which is 2,400 BC, there was a peak in winter rain, and then a gradual decline and a steep decline around 4,200 years ago, the 4.2 event as described. In contrast, there's a change in the rainfall patterns in the summer that occurred much, much earlier, around 4,700, 4,800 BC. The Indian summer monsoon had declined, which you can see where the peak dips down to become from the blue to the red. And then the Indian summer monsoon also weakened significantly around 4,200 years ago. So what it suggests is that both rainfall systems declined at the same time, and both became unpredictable at the same time. But both had been operating more independently in the period beforehand. So that is particularly interesting in terms of our understanding of dynamics of rainfall and rainfall systems. So in a sense, we do see evidence for climate change, and we do see evidence for influence on the winter and summer rainfall patterns, but we don't necessarily see correlation of the two until this 4.2 event. Now, the next piece of evidence that we have from our research is in many ways the most compelling. So a speleothem, a stalagmite from a cave in northern Western India called DHR1, the Dharamjali cave stalagmite, has been analysed. Now, this stalagmite was apparently started to grow around 4.19 thousand years ago. So during the period of this climate change process. Now, what this speleothem has revealed is that there's not one period of extended drought that extended for many, many decades. What the speleothem has shown is that probably from around 4,200 years ago, for a relatively short period, if we're thinking about a 4,000-year block, but a very, very long period, if you talk about the life of an individual, what appears to have happened was that there was a 30-year period of extreme dryness. And then there was a period of recovery. And then there was a 60-year period of extreme dryness. And then a short period of recovery. And then ultimately, around 4,000 years ago, there was a 90-year period of increased dryness. This is extremely important because it suggests that we're not dealing with a simple, the rain stopped explanation, but we're dealing with a complex explanation of what's happening in a climatic system, but also a situation that will have impacted upon individual generations in different ways. One generation would have existed before the dry period and potentially passed away during the dry period. A different generation would have been born during the dry period and then have survived into the period of recovery. And then ultimately, once we get to the third of these periods, we got a dry period that extended to 90 years in a period in human history where it's extraordinarily unlikely that anyone lived from the beginning until the end. So we're talking about multiple shifts between what is normal and what is not normal, what is predictable and what is not predictable, and a period, in essence, of fundamental change and transformation in climate. So how do people live in this environment? Once we know this as a parameter that's operating in the background, how do people live? How straightforward is it? That is really what we wanted to get to with our project research. A lot of what we've attempted to do on the ground is informed by using remote sensing and satellite images, landscape analysis, and studying of human occupation of the landscape. We've applied a multiple method approach. We're trying to understand the dynamics of river systems and how they move, how they influence where people live in the landscape, and also realizing that the floodplains of Punjab and Sindh are extraordinarily dynamic and very, very changeable. Now, inevitably, this part of our research is extremely complicated, and I could probably have presented a lecture just on this element by itself. I encourage anyone that's interested to please track down any of the papers that have got my name attached to them. They go off in many different directions, depending on who I'm collaborating with. But some of the research we're doing at the minute is trying to understand the nature of settlement distribution in the Indus River Basin throughout recorded settlement history. Where we've focused primarily, and what I'm going to concentrate on in terms of what I present to you, is the work that we've done on the plains of northwestern India. This is the area of Haryana, parts of Punjab, and parts of Rajasthan. Now, this is work that was started in 2008 and continued until 2014. So we combine landscape reconstruction, settlement distribution analysis, and also excavation, and I'll cover each one of those components. So we've looked at individual settlements in many areas and done surveys on the ground, but we've also combined that with attempts to reconstruct, the hydrology of northwestern India. And in many ways, it's become clear that we need to move away from an argument that suggests that there's one giant lost river that explains everything, largely because this landscape is a landscape of rivers and it's a landscape of lost rivers. And we've reconstructed many watercourses across Punjab and Haryana that are now not perennial, but have left marks on the landscape. And we've used different methods, whether they are remote sensing imagery, Landsat imagery, Sentinel imagery, or high-resolution topographic imagery, which has been given to us by the German Space Agency. Now, what we've managed to do is to reconstruct the hydrology of the plains of northwestern India to demonstrate that there are actually many thousands of kilometers of paleochannels, and you can see them both as traces on satellite imagery, but also highlighted here on the topography of the landscape. You can see at the northern edge of this image the traces of the floodplain of the Sutlej River, which is extraordinarily mobile and has a very sharp edge. On the southern part of this image, you can see the desert of northern Rajasthan. And in the middle area, you can see traces of many, many different river channels of different shapes and sizes. This is an extraordinarily complex landscape, and we're now attempting to understand the distribution of archaeological settlements within that landscape. Now, what we've realized is that the period of British control in India actually created probably what is in effect the first large-scale archaeological survey of the entirety of the Indian subcontinent. This is a survey that was conducted before the Archaeological Survey of India actually existed, and the Archaeological Survey of India then became a fundamental part of that process. What has become clear to us is that the maps that were produced by the Survey of India as a result of the revenue surveys and the topographic surveys that were carried out actually documented the locations of thousands and thousands of archaeological sites. These were not marked as archaeological sites on the map. They were marked as mound features, and you can see some examples on the top of this image. And in actual fact, these sorts of mound features document sites that in many cases were not discovered or rediscovered by archaeologists for many, many decades after the surveys were undertaken. What you can see in the image lower to the right actually shows the archaeological site of Rakhigarhi, which was first recorded by archaeologists in the 1960s, but this was a map that was produced and published in 1905. The mounds at Rakhigarhi are documented there, as are a series of other mounds which my collaborative project has subsequently excavated. All of the mounds that we have excavated were documented over 100 years ago. This was a complete surprise. When we realized the scale of this work, we set out to systematically map the location of these mound features and to try and visit as many of them as we could on the ground. What we've realized is that there is quite a variable degree of preservation of these mound features, but thousands and thousands of them are still preserved. And we've started to document them systematically. And what I'm going to do now is just to give you a brief run through to emphasize the nature of change in the Indus settlement system. Now, this map shows the location of Rakhigarhi on the lower right-hand side, the location of some of the rivers that I've spoken about and the river channels, and the location of the sites that existed before the rise of the Indus cities during the early Harappan period. What's interesting is when we look at what happens over time, when we shift to the Indus, the urban period, we see a change in settlement distribution. Some parts of the plain appear to have been abandoned, and there seems to be some consolidation into the area around Rakhigarhi. But interestingly enough, it's not the only large-scale settlement that dominates the landscape. So we see a process of abandonment and resettlement. After Rakhigarhi is abandoned, we see a continuation of that process, abandonment and resettlement. Larger parts of the plain of northwestern India are abandoned. Rakhigarhi itself appears to have been abandoned, and new settlements are established in different areas. What I would like to emphasize here is that this shows that change and displacement of settlement, movement of populations across the landscape was commonplace during the Indus civilization, during the urban period, and also when you look at it over time, before, during, and after. So again, coming back to this argument, change is not that unusual. And we sort of can recognize some of these things by focusing in detail on individual excavations at individual sites. Now, we've worked on a number of sites, including Masudpur 1, Masudpur 7, and Lohari Rago, which are close to Rakhigarhi. And although this doesn't look like an archaeological site, this is the nature of archaeology sites in Haryana. And students on the project have done cores into the subsurface and have thus been able to reconstruct the nature of the landscape that existed when the mound was occupied. What's clear now is that the sites that we've investigated in detail have access to water, but those water, that level of water availability is not obvious on the modern ground surface. It's only obvious when you look underneath the surface. For example, the site of Lohari Rago is sitting on the edge of a water channel, and it has a pond that was constructed right next to the mound 4,000 years ago. The site of Masudpur 1, which you can see on the right-hand side, is actually in a different context on the bend of the same water channel in an area where overbank flooding would have occurred and specific sorts of crops could have been grown quite easily. So we now can say that these settlements that we can see in the landscape are not sitting in a simple rural landscape, but they're sitting in a landscape that was extremely diverse, and the populations living in that landscape were making very specific choices about where they were putting settlements, how they were accessing water, and how they were controlling that water. And that was both water for life, but also water for crops and growing. We've studied these sites in a considerable degree of detail, conducted quite a lot of excavation and looking at large-scale exposures and detail about the distribution of archaeological material. We've looked at sites that were occupied before and after the 4.2 climate event, and we can now say a range of quite interesting things. Primarily, these village sites are characterized by a local style of material culture that's actually quite different to what we see at Rakhigarhi, Harappa, and Mohenjo-daro. There is some evidence for clear contact between these rural sites and the larger urban settlements, often in the form of large-scale storage vessels, which you can see an example at the bottom, or also in the examples of things like beads of gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian, and steatite, which are obviously moving around the landscape. But what we see in great profusion at these sites is an abundance of locally made ceramics that have local styles of decoration, local motifs, local signs carved in them, and local methods of manufacture. So what this really suggests is that there is a considerable degree of diversity at the rural scale in the Indus civilization. That's in the material culture sphere. That diversity is also evident when we look at the evidence for subsistence. So from these same sites, we've collected samples of soil which have been put through a process where we can extract carbonized food remains. And it's become clear that the inhabitants of these settlements were making use of wheat and barley, which are winter crops, but they were also making use of millet and rice. By and large, those things are not a surprise, but what is a surprise, or what was a surprise, was the fact that those crops were all being used before the development of Indus urban sites, during the period that the Indus cities existed, and also afterwards. So in actual fact, the populations living in rural environments were very carefully calibrating their life, and they were carefully adapted to living in these particular environments. They're living in an area where winter and summer rain is available. What we can see from looking at the proportions of individual crops at different sites, each of these, vertical columns here is an individual site. They're arranged from the ones on the left-hand side are closest to the desert. The ones on the right-hand side are closest to the monsoon rain concentrations. And over time, you can see each of the horizontal layers going from the bottom to the top is a different chronological period. So what you can see is that there's spatial variability from west to east, but there's also chronological change over time as well. So there does appear to be an increase in diversity. There does appear to be an increase in the proportions of the use of millet and rice over time and over space. However, what's particularly interesting is that these two sites, Masudpur 1 and Masudpur 7, appear to have been occupied at the same time. And at Masudpur 1, there was a concentration on summer crops, and at the same time at Masudpur 7, there was a concentration on winter crops. So the farmers are not making identical choices at these settlements. And similarly, over time at Masudpur 7, you can see that there's a shift from summer dominant to winter dominant to summer dominant cropping system. So we believe this suggests that the farmers were making choices and decisions continually over time, and that those choices reflect the ability to adapt, to be resilient, and to be sustainable in the face of a changing climatic situation. And we've hypothesized that that can be extended much further. Now, I realize that the images that I'm about to show you are actually already slightly out of date because of some new research that's been done, but that's the nature of research. So this map shows the distribution of archaeological sites in the Indus Basin. It shows winter rain, it shows summer rain, and then it produces some hypotheses about the distribution of different farming systems within this broad environment. When we produced this image, we suspected that the areas of Gujarat, which are within the zone of the Indian summer monsoon, are in fact dominated by summer crops, particularly millets of different types, and some instances of the presence of rice. The area of Sindh in southern Pakistan, we hypothesized that was an area where winter crops were dominant, largely because that's the only winter rain falls there. It's now apparent that in actual fact, there is evidence for the use of millet in Sindh as well. And that's almost certainly as a result of the availability of water from the Indus River and the use of overbank flooding to help support farming. The situation further to the north in the different parts of Punjab, however, something where we're much more confident that we've actually got a more nuanced set of circumstances. The area around Harappa, we supposed was an area where both winter and summer crops were used, but winter crops dominated because of the nature of the rainfall system and the predictability. And that seems to be borne out by the evidence of the archaeology. The area of northwestern India, however, where both winter and summer rain is available, appears to be the area where the most flexibility in choices were being made in the past. I have a few more slides and I'm nearly finished. We did actually also analyze plant seeds to try and work out whether they were undergoing water stress in this process of change and transformation. Interestingly, the plant seeds themselves did not seem to be undergoing water stress, at least the ones we analysed. So this perhaps suggests that the farmers that were growing these crops were ensuring that their crops had adequate water. We've also conducted some residue analysis to look at the types of food products that were being used in the past. And what you can see here is the results of stable isotope analysis that really demonstrate that there's a lot of variability in the types of food products that were being used. There's actually some relatively limited evidence for the use of dairy products. And the most evidence does seem to suggest that there was a complex mixture of certain types of meat products from sheep, goat, and pig, with a very wide range of plant-based fats as well. And this is evident at different sites, but it's also evident at different pottery vessels as well. So interestingly, that suggests that the Indus populations that have been studied probably have a complex diet that is actually extremely difficult to reconstruct, but does involve the use of both meat and plants to some degree. The last piece of information which I feel worth mentioning is that we've also studied the dynamics of animal movement, and we've been able to demonstrate that animals the bones of animals that were ending up at a number of different sites suggest that there was actually quite limited movement of animals between different parts of the Indus civilization. The thing that took us most by surprise was the animals that are most evident as being moved around the landscape are actually pigs. And there are examples of pigs that have been excavated at Harappa, which appear to have come either from different parts of northwestern India, There's also examples of pigs from Rakhigarhi that appear to have come from the area around Harappa. And there are a small number of examples of cattle that are also moving across the landscape. So again, complex stories that are difficult to reconstruct. The last piece of research that we're doing, which is the one that's the most ongoing, is conducting agent-based modeling to attempt to understand the types of decisions that all of this evidence helps us understand, the types of choices that people were making when they were choosing where to put their settlements, choosing what crops to grow, and choosing how to live. I think fundamentally there's an issue here where we know that there's a great deal of variability, and I think there's a variability in the crops themselves, variability in the landscapes, and using things like agent-based modeling means that we can make quite specific decisions about the types of choices that people were making in the past. Now, I hope I haven't taken you off into too many different tangents, and I hope now, in some respects, I've actually given you enough information to believe what I'm going to say as I talk to this very last slide. Now, the talk at the beginning I made reference to the concepts of fragility and resilience. I think in essence, what we can say for sure is that the climate and the weather in both the winter and the summer around 4,200 years ago underwent change. What I have suggested is that introduced a degree of entropy, change into the system, the gradual move towards disordering of the system. So whereby we had the Indus civilization that existed, complex urban system, lots of movement and redistribution of material, a system where change was very, very common. What we saw was change beyond the limits of what was predictable and what was familiar to the population. So we have a situation where what seems to have happened is that large urban centers where large groups of populations lived potentially became unstable over an extended period. This is not an event that happened over a short period, but probably a process that took place over about 200 years, involving multiple periods of drought. So in that respect, I do not believe that it's a collapse, but what I do believe is that this represents the fundamental vulnerability and fragility of urban centers. They are fundamentally reliant on their food supply. Food security is critical. And if food security can't be maintained, then problems arise. What I think is the fundamental underpinning of the Indus civilization, and what I firmly believe is the fundamental building block, is the rural sector. And what I think occurred is probably a shift towards economic simplification in rural areas, a reduction in the scale of settlement, and a reduction in interaction networks, and a more or less an embracing of a resilient and sustainable lifestyle, whereby the rural lifeways that are the underpinnings of the Indus civilization just become the predominant mode of life. So smaller populations are more suited to risk mitigation. They're social environments where decision-making is much more straightforward. Flexibility is easier. So at a fundamental level, the village is a resilient scale of social life. Hopefully that's apparent from what I've said, and I'd like to thank you very much for all of your attention. Inevitably, a project like this, or these projects, are only possible with many, many people being involved. And I would just like to thank all of the people listed here, including many, many PhD students who've contributed their research to the projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We like to stop the sharing so that we can get into the question and answer.
Here we
go. Wonderful. I mean, this is, but I have, even before we get into this topic, one of our colleagues has asked a question. Are you related in any way to Flinders Petrie, pioneering Egyptologist?
I'm not actually. I'm not a direct descendant, but there are actually many Petries now.
I see. Okay.
So
Thank you for that. Now, to the core question, right? See,
yes.
if the climate changes cause such a huge disruption in stages,
Yep.
we have not seen something similar happening, let's say in the same Indian or Indo-Pakistan space in the last 3,000 years. Why is it that it happened then, but not subsequently? We have had, and we do have, continue to have a combination of rural and urban, highly centralized subsequent governments. We have had long periods of droughts. I don't know if it was 90 years, but something that the later civilizations could sustain. What
Right.
happened then that caused such a huge disruption?
That's an interesting question. I think probably what's interesting from the paleoclimate evidence, this event at 4,200 BC is actually regarded as a relatively small scale climate event, in the sense that it's actually not as global as people would say. There's a lot more variation spatially. And I think in actual fact, the Indus region is one of the regions which is very susceptible because of these two weather systems existing in the same place. So the fact that both weather systems were disrupted at the same time, I think created a bigger problem. Whereas for Mesopotamia, they've got, it's a different scenario. So in Mesopotamia, there's also no clear pattern. But there have been other instances. So there's a thing called the Little Ice Age that exists in the medieval period, which actually had a fairly substantial climatic impact. And so I think there are several examples where there are periods of change and a crisis, I think, that have occurred. But I think largely people have been able to sort of work around them. In this particular case, I think we are probably dealing with the first time in human history where we had these big cities that existed, big societies, large-scale states, and then they were being impacted by it. So I think it's a very long answer to your question, but I think there is actually something quite clear that there was some very, very clear process of change there.
No, I mean, the real worry for me is this is a culture over the last 4 or 5 days we are learning, which has reached such sophisticated communication models, command and control models, very common, set of measures, standards, weights, everything.
Yeah.
And they are hit with problems, which modern societies are hit with. But I would have thought, and they also had a mix of urban and rural, largely rural or small urban centers, and only 4 or 5 big cities.
Yeah.
Surely they would have come up with a far better. I mean, it's easy for me to say today, but I'm just wondering, could they have not come up with a much better model of coping with the changing, climatic conditions, to the abandonment of everything? I mean, complete stoppage of all the things that we are showing, that there are no more seals, no more factories, no more the things that actually define that very culture. No wars, it's very clear. I mean, at least overwhelming evidence that they were not wiped off. And to the extent of, yes, drought, I'm sure, you have very solid evidence, but something is beyond belief. I mean, I'm not a researcher. I'm just a layman sitting here and trying to really get my head around after your lecture as to, does it have to be this way only? They have not figured out a solution. I don't know if we can even answer such a speculation from my side.
In some ways, the solution is what they did, which was this choice towards simplification. And I mean, I think that we tend to think that a dramatic change like that would mean that everybody died, for example. It doesn't seem like that's the sort of crisis. There is actually long-term continuity of the population.
Okay.
One of the things I've speculated about, when I've talked to people about this before, I think that in actual fact, my understanding of most of the people that I've spoken to, my Indian colleagues and friends, they have a complex relationship with the rural sector. Families have a rural element,
Right,
and an urban element, and it's very tempting to speculate that sort of relationship between the farm and the city existed in the past. And in actual fact, what we're talking about is a realignment of behavior, and perhaps so it's not such a big shift. So it does depend on the degree to which you think that all of those, the big unifying things, are important or not. I do think, it's very clear that things change. The connections with Mesopotamia change. The nature of socioeconomic dynamics in the broader region changed. And so obviously something occurred. It
Their
wasn't
whole culture
fast.
changed, no?
Sorry, what was that?
Virtually their whole culture changed. Whatever they were doing for a living, their production, everything changed. Economics.
Well, to a certain point. I mean, it's if you're talking about the production of, seals and weights, but that's in effect, that's one layer of everything that they were doing. Everything else, everyone's still growing food. They're making pottery. They're engaging in interaction. They're still engaging in production. But I think it seems to indicate that the long-range connectivity is much more difficult, and therefore probably much less important. People are needing to think about risk and risk mitigation rather than producing fancy stuff that they might want to sell to somebody in Mesopotamia. Or give. So those are the sorts of transformations, I think. So in some respects, it's a major, major transformation. But in other respects, that's sort of what I'm trying to say. Change was actually relatively normal.
It seems to me like every IT programmer in Bangalore suddenly decides to stop working because there is water shortage and persistent water shortage in Bangalore, and just go to the rural area and just become agriculturists overnight. I know it's to me the impact is of that nature. I don't know if you should stretch it any further, but it's quite still shocking to me. There is a question.
But I think in a way, and this is where, I think fundamentally the water just didn't turn off. Okay. But the availability of water has changed. And I think if you end up over multiple generations living in a city becomes unhealthy, and your family is becoming ill and sick, or there is a food shortage, all of these things, you are no doubt going to make changes to your living arrangements. I just think that's a sort of almost like a given that humans will make those sorts of decisions. And I think so in many ways that a lot of future research should be devoted to what is it like? What are the decisions that should be being made in these circumstances? I think that's an extremely interesting scenario, and it's really something that we need to think about, because I think it's important. It's important for us to think about generally, and it has important significance for our broader understanding of our own place in society and lifestyles.
I think that's where the next question comes from, say, MV Bhaskar, where he's saying your suggestion that climate change is a main driver of culture, or the dramatic change in Indus seems secure in the Indus context, but seems problematic in today's context because it normalizes climate change.
Sorry, can you say that it's problematic in the which context?
In today's context of the modern world.
Right.
Because it normalizes climate change. I think what he is driving at is that you're assuming that climate has to change. If it changes, you have to react to that rather than taking mitigating stance of trying to do things that will not impact climate change.
Not just react, you have to adapt to it.
No, I don't know. I know Bhaskar is still there in the channel. I'm sure he can explain.
Yeah, but so in a sense, I think it would be a mistake to assume that the climate is always the same. I think also there is a difference between the example that I've given and the current situation. I mean, we have a situation of climate change that's being driven by change in proportions of carbon in the atmosphere that's resulting in a different set of drivers. Whereas what I'm talking about is an example of, I guess, what you could call natural climate change. I don't think the Indus populations caused climate change. That's not what happened. So in that respect, it's not a correlation causation example, but it is one where there's something interesting going on.
Right. Yeah. No, it's not that, they overuse the water to the extent of drying the channel, or kept doing drilling down for getting all the water down below. It is just that there are seismic events, other climatic events, which simply result in reduction of water, which is beyond your control. You cannot go and change the Himalayan plates from changing direction or things like that. Okay. He's saying my question should be taken in the context of maybe Bhaskar, you can change, reword your question and I will take it. But your point, I understand, Dr. Petrie, in terms of how we should be really approaching this. Now, as to
I've been pulled away to another meeting, so I probably have time for literally one more question, and then I have to go.
Okay. So then there is another question which I think you can immediately answer. Did this 4.2K event also impact the Mesopotamian civilization?
That's a very good question. So there are two schools of thought. One, Professor Harvey Weiss and a number of other scholars have argued that there was a profound impact upon Mesopotamia. Okay. And he's the one that argues about mega drought and collapse. But then there are many other scholars who have said that this is not a consistent pattern. There is evidence for change and there is evidence for impact in certain areas, but it's not consistent. And so that some areas people made adaptations, some areas there was a great deal of continuity. So it seems to say that there is clear evidence that the monsoon and the Western disturbance rain system were affected, but the impact upon humans is not consistent. So to describe it as a global event is actually sort of misleading. In some areas, there's no evidence whatsoever. But what we do know is that places like the Nile River, for example, benefits from the summer monsoon dropping rain in Central Africa, which then flows through the Nile. So the weather systems are the types of dynamics that link all of these areas together. They're extremely important.
Okay. Thank you. I mean,
I'm really sorry, I just have to go.
I understand. We can collect all the questions, send you, and if you have time, you can certainly answer them, and we will just add it to this page. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Petrie. That was a wonderful lecture. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Okay, Gauri.
That brings us to the end of day 5. Tomorrow we have 2 interesting lectures lined up. Metal Technology in Harappan Times by Dr. Jeevan Kharakwal, and Harappan Art with special reference to the National Museum collection by Dr. D.P. Sharma. Tomorrow we'll be concluding this event. So we expect all of you to attend right till the end. Thank you so much. For all those people who may have missed our lectures either fully or in part, they'll be available in our YouTube channel. Thank you. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you all. And we are sorry we couldn't take all your questions, but we will get in touch with them. We will take the questions to Dr. Petrie and get them answered and add it here to the channel. Thank you all. And once again, we will see you tomorrow, our last day of this IndoFest.